I stared at my phone screen reading the family group text that would change everything. My 7-year-old son Caleb had just died in a hospital bed, and instead of comfort, I got this, "He was just a kid. Life goes on. We already used the $800K insurance for your sister's wedding. It's non-refundable." Stop being dramatic, Vivian. $800,000. My dead son's life insurance money. Gone. For my sister's wedding. I hit leave group and disappeared that night. For 5 years, I built something they never saw coming. I transformed from a broken librarian into a woman with power connections and a very long memory. I studied their every move, documented their secrets, and waited for the perfect moment. That moment came when they needed me most. My sister's daughter was dying. Leukemia. I was the only bone marrow match in the family. They found me, fell to their knees in a hospital parking lot, and begged me to save her life. I looked down at the 3 people who had stolen my son's future and destroyed me when I was at my weakest. My father, who forged documents to steal Caleb's money. My mother, who chose greed over her grandson's life. My sister, who wore my dead son's handmade necklace to her wedding like a trophy. "I'll save her," I said quietly. "But first you're going to confess what you really did to Caleb, all of it, publicly." Because what they didn't know was that I had discovered the truth. My son didn't just die in that accident. They had let him die. And now, 5 years later, justice would finally kneel at my feet. This is the story of how a mother's love became a family's reckoning. My name is Vivian Chen. I'm 35 years old, and I work as the head librarian at Maplewood Public Library in our small Iowa town. 3 years ago, I became a widow when my husband David died in a farming accident, leaving me to raise our 7-year-old son Caleb alone. What I'm about to tell you happened long before that terrible night when everything changed back, when I still believed family meant protection and love was unconditional. The evening light was fading to that soft golden color that only happens in Iowa summers, when Caleb climbed onto our porch swing beside me, clutching his worn copy of Where the Red Fern Grows. This was our sacred ritual, the one thing that remained constant in our world that had been turned upside down by loss. He settled against my shoulder, his small fingers automatically reaching for the bookmark we'd made together from pressed flowers. "Will you always protect me, Mom?" Caleb asked the same question he'd posed every night for the past year since David's funeral. His voice carried that mixture of childish vulnerability and growing wisdom that broke my heart a little more each time. "Forever and always, sweetheart," I whispered back, kissing the top of his sandy brown hair that smelled like summer and innocence. "Nothing bad will ever happen to you as long as I'm here." As I opened the book to chapter 12, I caught myself studying his profile in the lamplight streaming through our front window. He had David's strong jawline and my green eyes, but there was something uniquely Caleb in the way he concentrated so intently on every word I read. Sometimes I would pause just to watch him memorizing every freckle, every expression, terrified that this perfect moment might somehow be stolen from me too. "When I grow up," Caleb announced during a break between chapters, "I'm going to be a doctor like Dr. Peterson and make you feel better when you're sad about Daddy." My throat tightened with that familiar mixture of pride and heartache. At 7 years old, my son already carried the weight of wanting to heal the world, starting with his broken mother. I managed what I hoped was a convincing smile, though inside my chest, fear whispered its constant refrain. What if something happens to him too? What if I lose the only good thing left in my life? "You'll make an amazing doctor," I told him, meaning every word. But you know what? Just being my son already makes me feel better every single day. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had always been a family tradition, but since David's death, these gatherings had become exercises in endurance rather than joy. The 3 of us sat around the mahogany dining table that had belonged to my grandmother, while Dad carved the pot roast with surgical precision, and Mom fussed over place settings that hadn't changed in 20 years. Caleb got an A+ on his science project about plants. I offered, hoping to steer conversation towards something positive. His teacher said it was the best in the class. That's nice, dear, Mom said, absently, already turning toward my sister Selena, who was checking her phone for the 100th time that evening. Selena, tell us about the catering tasting you had yesterday. I'm so excited about this wedding. And just like that, my son's achievement evaporated into background noise while everyone focused on Selena's upcoming marriage to Marcus, a corporate lawyer from Des Moines, who wore expensive suits and treated our small town like a temporary inconvenience. For the next 45 minutes, we discussed flower arrangements, invitation designs, and the cost of hiring a string quartet for the reception. Caleb ate his dinner quietly occasionally, glancing at me with those perceptive eyes that seemed to understand more than any 7-year-old should about adult dynamics and favoritism. I reached over to squeeze his hand, a silent acknowledgement that we were a team of 2 in a room full of people who had already moved on from David's memory and rarely seemed to notice we were still struggling. The venue coordinator thinks we should go with the premium package, Selena was saying, her engagement ring catching the overhead light as she gestured enthusiastically. It's more expensive, but Marcus says we only get married once, so we might as well do it right. Dad nodded approvingly while cutting into his second helping of roast. That's the kind of thinking that builds a successful life. Marcus is going to be a good provider for you, sweetheart. I swallowed my hurt along with another bite of mashed potatoes, wondering when providing financially had become more important than providing emotionally. David had been a good provider too, working dawn to dusk on the farm that had been in his family for generations. But his real gift had been his enormous heart and gentle hands that could calm a frightened animal or rock a feverish child back to sleep. After we returned home that night, Caleb disappeared into his room while I cleaned up our few dishes and tried to shake off the familiar feeling of being invisible in my own family. When he emerged 30 minutes later, he was hiding something behind his back and wearing the mischievous grin that always reminded me so much of David. I made you something special, he announced, producing a handmade necklace crafted from colorful rope and wooden beads he'd been collecting all summer. This is my protection charm for you, Mom, so nothing bad ever happens to you like what happened to Daddy. My heart nearly burst as he stood on his tiptoes to fasten the slightly crooked clasp around my neck. The beads were uneven and the rope was fraying in places, but it was the most beautiful piece of jewelry I'd ever owned because it was made from pure love by small hands that wanted to keep me safe. It's perfect, I whispered, tears blurring my vision as I pulled him into a fierce hug. I'll never take it off. Promise, he asked seriously. Promise. I replied, sealing a vow I intended to keep forever. The next morning, I was making pancakes in our sunny kitchen when my phone shattered the peaceful quiet with its urgent, demanding ring. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Hospital, and something cold and terrible immediately settled in my stomach as I answered with trembling fingers. Mrs. Chen, your son was hit by a delivery truck on Maple Street. You need to come immediately. Dr. Harrison's voice cut through the phone line like a blade, each word destroying the peaceful morning I'd been savoring just moments before. The pancake batter I'd been stirring splattered across our kitchen floor as the bowl slipped from my numb fingers, and I watched the yellow mixture spread across the linoleum like spilled sunshine while my brain struggled to process what I'd just heard. Hit by a truck. Caleb. My Caleb, who should have been safely walking to school with his Superman backpack and the lunch I'd packed with extra cookies because it was Friday. The phone clattered to the counter as I grabbed my keys with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My bare feet slipping in the pancake batter as I rushed toward the door. I didn't bother with shoes or a jacket, didn't lock the house, didn't even turn off the stove where more pancakes were burning in the skillet. The 15-minute drive to St. Mary's Hospital became an eternity of desperate bargaining with God, my foot pressing the accelerator harder with each frantic prayer. Please let him be okay. Please let this be a mistake. Please don't take him to... I whispered over and over, the words becoming a mantra against the growing terror in my chest. Every red light felt like torture, every slow-moving car ahead of me, another obstacle between me and my son who needed me more than he'd ever needed me before. The emergency room hit me with its assault of fluorescent lighting that turned everything pale and unreal, the sharp antiseptic smell that couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of fear and suffering. Urgent voices echoed off sterile walls as medical staff rushed between curtained areas, their scrubs a blur of navy and forest green. I stumbled to the reception desk, barely able to form the words Caleb Chen, before a nurse was guiding me through a maze of corridors toward the trauma unit. Dr. Harrison met me outside a room where machines beeped with mechanical urgency, his usually composed face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that couldn't quite hide his devastation, as he began explaining medical terms that my brain refused to absorb. Internal bleeding, massive head trauma, multiple surgical attempts. Each phrase hammered against my consciousness like physical blows. Through the doorway, I could see my beautiful boy lying motionless on a hospital bed that dwarfed his small frame, his sandy hair matted with dried blood, his face so pale it looked translucent under the harsh lights. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that seemed to be breathing for him, their rhythmic sounds, the only indication that life still flickered somewhere inside his broken body. I rushed to his bedside and took his small hand in both of mine, shocked by how cold his fingers felt, despite the heated blankets tucked around him. "Mommy's here, sweetheart," I whispered, leaning close to his ear. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." His chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, but there was no response, no flutter of eyelids, no squeeze of recognition from the fingers that had fastened my protection charm necklace just hours before. As the hours crawled by, I found myself reciting every bedtime story we'd ever shared, every silly song we'd sung together in the car, every conversation about his dreams of becoming a doctor. I told him about the pancakes I'd been making when the call came, promised him we'd finish reading Where the Red Fern Grows. As soon as he woke up, described the science project we'd planned for next week about butterflies and metamorphosis. Dr. Harrison checked on us every hour, his reports growing more grim each time. The internal bleeding wasn't responding to treatment. The brain swelling showed no signs of reduction. His vital signs were weakening despite everything they were doing. I refused to understand what he was really telling me, clinging to medical miracles and the fierce belief that love alone could pull my son back from wherever he was drifting. At 3:47 a.m., Dr. Harrison entered our room for the final time, carrying a clipboard with papers I didn't want to see. His hands trembled slightly as he handed me the official documents, and I stared at the words that would haunt me forever. Caleb Michael Chen, age 7, cause of death. Massive head trauma. The black ink on white paper made it real in a way that all the machines and medical explanations hadn't. A sound erupted from somewhere deep inside me, a primal scream of grief and rage that echoed through the hospital corridors and brought nurses running. I heard footsteps approaching and retreating, heard hushed voices discussing sedatives and grief counselors, but none of it mattered, because my world had just ended with the stopping of a 7-year-old's heart. The reality of my complete aloneness settled over me like a suffocating blanket. David was gone, and now Caleb was gone, and I was floating in a universe where nothing made sense anymore. The protection charm he'd made me felt heavy around my neck, a cruel reminder of how powerless love really was against random tragedy and twisted metal. While the nurses gave me time to say goodbye, I began gathering Caleb's belongings from the bedside table, with mechanical movements, my hands operating independently of my shattered mind. His Superman backpack sat in the corner where the paramedics had left it, still containing the remnants of his normal Thursday that had ended so catastrophically. Inside, among his school folders and the half-eaten sandwich from his lunch, I found a small, spiral notebook I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I opened it to pages filled with his careful printing, documenting observations and conversations in the innocent way only children can. Most entries were typical 7-year-old observations about playground activities and favorite snacks. But the final entry, dated just yesterday in his careful block letters, made my blood freeze in my veins. Grandpa Gerald said if Mommy doesn't listen to the family, bad things happen to little boys. The words in Caleb's notebook burned in my mind as I sat beside his still form, trying to make sense of what my innocent son had written about his grandfather. Before I could process the full meaning of his entry, I heard familiar voices in the hallway outside our room. 4 hours had passed since Dr. Harrison had called to tell them about the accident, and my parents were finally arriving. I expected them to rush through the door to embrace me in my devastation to ask how Caleb was doing or what the doctors had said. Instead, I watched through the doorway as Gerald and Margaret Chen walked straight past our room toward the hospital billing desk at the far end of the corridor. Their voices carried clearly in the sterile air as they spoke to the administrative clerk about arrangements that needed to be made. "We'll need information about funeral home partnerships," I heard my father say in the same business-like tone he used when negotiating grain prices at the co-op. "What are the differences in cost between burial and cremation, and how quickly can insurance paperwork be processed?" My mother's voice joined his equally practical and devoid of emotion. "We're working with a tight timeline here. There's a wedding in 3 weeks, and we need to understand all our options for managing expenses efficiently." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I listened to them discuss my son's death like a financial transaction. When Margaret added, "Well, at least the policy will cover everything plus some extra for the family," my grief-stricken confusion began shifting toward something else entirely. They were talking about Caleb's life insurance, the small policy David and I had taken out when he was born, meant to cover college expenses someday. It took another 2 hours before either of them actually entered our room. Gerald appeared first, adjusting his tie as if he were attending a business meeting rather than saying goodbye to his grandson. Margaret followed, clutching her purse and glancing around the medical equipment with obvious distaste. "Vivian, dear," my mother said, patting my shoulder with the same absent gesture she might use to acknowledge a distant acquaintance. "This is certainly tragic, but these things happen. You're young enough to rebuild your life." My father moved to the foot of Caleb's bed, studying the machines with clinical interest, rather than grandfatherly grief. "The doctors say there was nothing that could be done," he stated matter-of-factly. "Sometimes we have to accept that it's simply someone's time to go." I stared at them in disbelief, waiting for some sign of the grandparents who had bounced Caleb on their knees just 3 days ago at Sunday dinner. Instead, I saw 2 people already mentally moving past this inconvenience toward more pressing concerns. They spent exactly 15 minutes in the room before retreating to handle necessary arrangements, leaving me alone with my son's body and a growing sense that I was witnessing something fundamentally wrong. 6 hours after the accident, Selena made her grand entrance with all the drama she brought to every situation. She swept into the hospital lobby wearing a perfectly coordinated outfit and carrying a Starbucks coffee with her fiancé Marcus trailing behind in his expensive suit. I watched from the doorway as she paused to check her reflection in the lobby's mirrored wall before approaching the elevator. When she finally reached our floor, Selena walked directly past Caleb's room toward where our parents were still discussing logistics with hospital staff. I expected her to at least acknowledge my presence to offer some word of comfort or sisterly support. Instead, she positioned herself just close enough that I could hear every word as she whispered to Marcus with barely contained excitement. "This is actually a blessing in disguise," she said, her voice carrying that calculated tone she used when maneuvering for advantage. "We can redirect the insurance money for the wedding venue upgrade we wanted. The premium package at Riverside Manor just became affordable." Marcus nodded approvingly, pulling out his phone to presumably call their wedding coordinator. "Should we book it today before someone else gets the date? This kind of opportunity doesn't come along often." I felt my world tilt on its axis as I realized they were discussing my dead son's insurance money like found treasure. Selena glanced toward Caleb's room with what I can only describe as satisfaction rather than sorrow, as if his death had solved a problem rather than created a devastating loss. For the next 12 hours, I sat alone in those unforgiving plastic waiting room chairs, while my family buzzed around handling what they called practical matters. Gerald disappeared to meet with funeral directors, comparing prices and package deals with the enthusiasm of someone shopping for a new car. Margaret coordinated with the hospital's social worker about paperwork and timelines. Selena spent most of her time on the phone with wedding vendors, suddenly able to afford upgrades that had been out of reach the week before. Not once during those endless hours did anyone ask how I was holding up. No one brought me food or coffee, offered to call friends who might provide comfort, or simply sat with me in my grief. They moved around me like I was invisible, a minor character in the drama of their financial windfall, rather than the mother who had just lost everything that mattered. I watched other families in the waiting room support each other through their own crises, holding hands and sharing tissues, and taking turns keeping vigil. Meanwhile, I sat completely alone, clutching Caleb's notebook and trying to understand how blood relatives could be so calculating in the face of such devastating loss. The isolation was almost as painful as the grief itself, a secondary wound that cut just as deep. Gerald organized Caleb's funeral with military efficiency, choosing the least expensive options and scheduling the service for the earliest possible date. "The sooner we move on, the better," he announced when I questioned the rushed timeline. "Dwelling on tragedy doesn't help anyone heal." 3 days after my son's sparse funeral, where more attention was paid to the post-service reception timeline than to honoring his memory, I sat in my empty house trying to figure out how to continue existing. That's when I opened my laptop and found an email from Midwest Family Insurance that would change everything. Policy number 789456, death benefit of $800,000, has been successfully dispersed to designated beneficiary. $800,000. I stared at that number on my laptop screen until the digits blurred together, trying to process what it meant for my shattered life. When David and I had taken out that life insurance policy on Caleb years ago, it had seemed like a responsible parent decision, a safety net that would ensure his college education even if something happened to us. Now, in the cruel mathematics of loss, it represented the only financial lifeline that might keep me afloat, while I figured out how to exist without my son. The next morning I drove to Midwest Family Insurance on Hope Street, the irony of the address not lost on me, as I parked outside the modest brick building where David and I had signed so many documents during happier times. My hands shook as I applied lipstick in the rearview mirror, trying to make myself presentable enough for what I hoped would be a straightforward transaction. At least Caleb's future fund will help me rebuild, I thought, clinging to this fragile optimism like a drowning person grasps driftwood. The insurance office smelled like coffee and copy toner, with motivational posters about protection and peace of mind, covering walls painted in soothing beige. Nancy, the receptionist I'd known for years through David's farm insurance policies, looked up from her computer with the sympathetic smile I'd grown accustomed to seeing since the accident. "Vivian, honey, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, reaching across the counter to squeeze my hand. "Caleb was such a sweet boy. What can I help you with today?" "I need to discuss the life insurance claim," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I received an email saying the benefits were dispersed, but I haven't seen any paperwork yet." Nancy's expression shifted from sympathy to confusion as she typed my name into her system. She frowned at her screen, then typed again, her fingers moving more slowly as if she were double-checking something that didn't make sense. That's odd," she murmured, clicking through several screens. "Let me get Jennifer to help you. She handles all the life insurance claims." Jennifer Morrison emerged from a back office, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades delivering both good and terrible news to grieving families. She gestured for me to follow her to a private consultation room, and something in her careful politeness made my stomach tighten with unexpected dread. "Mrs. Chen, I want to express my deepest condolences." Jennifer began settling behind her desk and pulling up files on her computer. "I've been handling insurance claims for 23 years, and losing a child is the worst tragedy any parent can face." I nodded, waiting for her to explain the disbursement process and when I could expect to receive the funds. Instead, her face grew increasingly uncomfortable as she studied her monitor, scrolling through what appeared to be several screens of information. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen, but there seems to be some confusion," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not listed as the beneficiary on policy number 7894556. The policyholder and sole beneficiary is Gerald Hale." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable reshaping my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my family. "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. "David and I set up that policy when Caleb was born. I'm his mother." Jennifer turned her monitor toward me, and I found myself staring at official documents that made no sense. There was Gerald's signature bold and unmistakable on a beneficiary change form dated 5 years ago. The date made my blood run cold because I remembered exactly when that was 2 months after David's funeral, when I'd been barely functional with grief and struggling to manage the farm finances alone. "According to our records, Mr. Hale submitted this change when your son was 2 years old," Jennifer explained, her voice growing more uncomfortable with each word. "As the policyholder, he had the legal right to designate any beneficiary he chose. The change was properly notarized and processed according to standard procedures." I studied the paperwork with growing horror, recognizing Gerald's handwriting on forms I'd never seen before. He'd changed my son's life insurance beneficiary to himself while I was at my most vulnerable, drowning in widowhood and financial uncertainty. The timing was so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that I could barely breathe as the full scope of his betrayal became clear. "Where is the money now?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. "The full $800,000 was electronically transferred to Mr. Hale's designated account yesterday morning," Jennifer replied, checking her computer one final time. "The claim was processed quickly because all the paperwork was in order." I left the insurance office in a daze, my phone trembling in my hands as I sat in my car and dialed Gerald's number. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second call rang 6 times before disconnecting. The third call again hit voicemail, my father's recorded voice cheerfully instructing callers to leave a detailed message. On the 4th attempt, he finally answered, his voice carrying that forced casualness people use when they're expecting confrontation. "Vivian, sweetheart, how are you holding up?" he asked, as if he hadn't been dodging my calls for the past hour. "Dad, I just came from the insurance office," I said, cutting straight through his pretense. "They said you're the beneficiary on Caleb's policy, that you changed it 5 years ago." There was a long pause before he responded, and I could hear him calculating his response. "Well, yes, there were some legal complications after David passed," he said finally. "Insurance matters can be very complex, especially when someone dies intestate. We can discuss all the details later at Sunday dinner." "Legal complications," I repeated, my voice shaking with growing rage. "You stole my son's insurance money while I was grieving my husband." "Now, Vivian, that's a very harsh way to put it," Gerald said, his tone becoming patronizing. "Family finances are complicated, and sometimes parents have to make difficult decisions to protect everyone's interests. We'll sort this all out when we can sit down together properly." Before I could respond, he hung up, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. My family had planned this while I was broken and vulnerable, systematically stealing from my dead son while pretending to support me through the worst period of my life. That's when my phone buzzed with a group text that made me drop the device onto my car floor in horror. The message appeared in our family chat, casual and matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing weekend dinner plans rather than the destruction of my entire world. "Already transferred the $800K to premier wedding venues for Selena's reception. It's completely non-refundable, so don't even ask." I picked up my phone from the car floor with trembling hands, rereading that casual announcement about my son's insurance money being transferred to a wedding venue like it was the most natural thing in the world. The numbness that had protected me through the funeral and the insurance office visit suddenly shattered, replaced by a rage so pure and white-hot that I could barely see straight. My fingers moved across the keyboard before my rational mind could stop them. "My son is dead, and you stole his future." The response came within seconds, as if Selena had been waiting for my reaction with gleeful anticipation. He was just a kid who would have been expensive anyway. Life goes on and we have real adults to think about. I stared at those words until they burned themselves into my retinas. Expensive. She'd called my beautiful, innocent son expensive, as if his life could be measured in dollars and cents, as if his dreams of becoming a doctor and healing the world were just inconvenient budget line items that had been successfully eliminated. Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't involve profanity and death threats. My mother's message appeared in the group chat, her tone carrying that dismissive authority she'd perfected over decades of managing family dynamics to her liking. The money is spent. Your sister's wedding is in 2 weeks. Stop being dramatic. Stop being dramatic. My 7-year-old son was dead. His insurance money had been stolen by his own grandfather, and I was being told to stop being dramatic because it might interfere with a wedding reception that was being funded by his corpse. I was still sitting in the insurance office parking lot processing this avalanche of cruelty when my phone rang with an incoming video call from the family group. Part of me wanted to decline to drive home and hide under my covers until this nightmare ended, but some masochistic impulse made me answer. Gerald's face appeared on my screen first, sitting in his familiar recliner with the confidence of a man who believed he'd successfully navigated a delicate situation. Margaret appeared next from her kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, as if she'd been interrupted while preparing dinner rather than destroying her daughter's life. "Vivian, we need to talk about your attitude," Gerald began without preamble. "This family doesn't have time for your emotional outbursts right now. We have a wedding to focus on, and everyone needs to get over this tragedy and move forward constructively." "Get over it," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Get over my son's death. Honey, dwelling on negative things never helped anyone." Margaret chimed in her voice, carrying that patronizing sweetness she used when explaining obvious truths to dim children. "Caleb is in a better place now, and the money is being put to good use for the living family members who still have futures ahead of them." That's when Selena's face joined the call, and I felt my world tilt completely off its axis. Around her neck, nestled against her pale pink sweater, was Caleb's handmade protection necklace. The colorful rope and wooden beads he'd spent hours crafting with his small fingers, the last gift he'd given me with a promise that it would keep me safe from bad things. "Selena," I said, my voice barely controlled, "you're wearing Caleb's necklace." She glanced down at it with the casual indifference she might show toward any piece of costume jewelry, then looked back at the camera with a bright smile that made my stomach turn. "Oh, this little thing," she said, fingering the beads with manicured nails that had never made anything beautiful for someone else. "I found it in Mom's house when we were going through some boxes. It matches my wedding colors perfectly, and you know how hard it is to find the right accessories for ceremony photos." The words hit me like physical slaps. "That was the last thing Caleb made for me," I said, my voice breaking. "He gave it to me the night before he died." Selena's laugh was light and dismissive, the sound of someone brushing away an insignificant concern. "Well, he would have wanted family to use it, right? I mean, what's the point of leaving pretty things sitting in boxes when they can serve a purpose? Besides, he's not here to wear it himself, and it really does complement my dress beautifully." Something fundamental broke inside me at that moment, some essential piece of my humanity that had been holding together through grief and shock and financial betrayal. I watched my sister treating my dead son's final gift like a convenient accessory for her wedding photos, and I finally understood what I was really dealing with. My fists clenched so tightly that my fingernails drew blood from my palms, small crescents of pain that felt insignificant compared to the agony in my chest. My vision blurred with rage so intense it was almost like looking through water, and when it cleared, I saw my family's faces on the screen with perfect clarity for the first time in years. They weren't grieving grandparents and a bereaved aunt. They were predators who had systematically stripped my son of his dignity, his memory, and his financial worth, while I was too broken to protect him. They had viewed Caleb as nothing more than a financial asset to be liquidated when convenient. His death, a fortunate windfall that solved their wedding budget problems and eliminated a future drain on family resources. "You didn't just steal money," I said quietly, my voice deadly calm in a way that should have warned them. You stole my son's memory and dignity. Gerald waved his hand dismissively. Now you're being ridiculous, Vivian. Money is money and dead people don't need. I didn't let him finish. My phone flew across the car interior and smashed against the passenger window with a satisfying crack that spiderwebbed across the screen, like my heart had spiderwebbed across my chest. The video call disappeared into electronic silence, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing and the absolute certainty that I couldn't survive another day in the same world as these people. I drove home in a trance, my mind already calculating what I would need to disappear completely. 2 suitcases would be enough for clothes and essentials. I would take Caleb's diary, what remained of my savings, and nothing else that connected me to this family, or this town, or this life that had been systematically destroyed by people who should have loved us. That night I drove to Maplewood Cemetery through rain so heavy it felt like the sky was grieving with me. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the deluge, and I had to lean forward to see through the torrential downpour that had turned the cemetery's gravel roads into muddy streams. Lightning illuminated the simple granite headstone I'd been forced to choose from the funeral home's cheapest options, the words, "Beloved Son," carved beneath Caleb's name, because Gerald had deemed anything more elaborate unnecessary expense for someone so young. I fell to my knees in the mud beside his grave, clutching what remained of his protection necklace that I'd managed to retrieve from my broken phone case. The colorful rope was already starting to fray from where I'd gripped it so tightly, but I pressed it against my heart as rain soaked through my clothes and mixed with tears I could no longer control. They will kneel before what they destroyed, I promise you. I whispered into the storm, my voice barely audible above the thunder rolling across the Iowa plains. Every single one of them will pay for what they did to you, baby. As lightning flashed overhead, I began reciting every bedtime story we'd shared, every silly joke that had made him giggle, every whispered, "I love you, Mommy," that had made my world complete. I remembered how he'd insisted on carrying my books when we walked to the library together. His small hands struggling with volumes too heavy for his arms, but determined to help anyway. I thought about his dreams of becoming a doctor, his innocent observations about the world, his absolute faith that his mother would always protect him from harm. Each memory became fuel for the cold fire building in my chest, transforming grief into something harder and more dangerous. My family had stolen more than money from my son's grave. They had stolen his dignity, his memory, and his mother's ability to honor his legacy. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated what a mother becomes when she has nothing left to lose. The next morning, I began the methodical process of erasing Vivian Chen from existence. I closed my checking and savings accounts, withdrawing the $1,200 in cash that represented the entirety of my remaining financial independence. At the library where I'd worked for 8 years, I sent my resignation via email citing family emergency requiring immediate relocation, without providing contact information for follow-up questions. My landlord, Mrs. Patterson, accepted my sudden departure with the kind of resignation that comes from decades of rental property management. When I told her I was moving to be with family, the bitter irony of those words tasted like poison in my mouth. She wished me well and promised to mail my security deposit to a P.O. box I'd opened 3 towns over under a name that wouldn't lead anyone back to my destination. In my backyard, I built a fire in the old metal drum David had used for burning brush, feeding it with photograph albums that documented decades of family gatherings, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations. I watched my parents' faces curl and blacken in the flames, followed by pictures of Selena's engagement party, where she'd posed with the very jewelry that was now funding her wedding reception. The smoke carried away the last evidence of my connection to people who had never truly seen me as anything more than an inconvenience. The only items I preserved were Caleb's diary, his protection necklace, and a single photograph of the 2 of us reading together on our front porch swing. Everything else could burn, because the woman who had treasured those family memories was dead, killed as surely as her son had been killed, and what emerged from her ashes would be something entirely different. My 3-hour drive to Cedar Rapids became a journey of psychological metamorphosis, each mile marker representing another step away from victimhood toward something my family would never see coming. At the first gas station, I pulled out Caleb's diary and began reading it with the analytical eye of a detective, rather than the sentimental heart of a grieving mother. What I discovered in those innocent pages made my blood run cold with possibility. My 7-year-old son had been unconsciously documenting family secrets for months, recording conversations and observations that revealed patterns of behavior I'd been too naive to recognize. His entry about Grandpa's angry phone calls about money people suddenly took on new meaning when paired with his drawing of strangers at Grandpa's work building. His note about Mommy not supposed to know about the papers Grandpa signed aligned perfectly with the insurance beneficiary change that had stripped me of my son's death benefits. Caleb had been an unwitting intelligence gatherer, his innocent curiosity creating a record of Gerald's suspicious activities that went far beyond simple insurance fraud. As I studied his careful documentation of license plate numbers, overheard phone conversations, and strange meetings at odd hours, I realized my family's betrayal was part of a much larger pattern of deception. At a truck stop 50 miles from my destination, I bought a prepaid phone and began researching private investigators who specialized in insurance fraud. If my son had unknowingly documented evidence of larger crimes, then Gerald's vulnerability extended far beyond family disapproval. Financial crimes left paper trails, and paper trails could be followed by professionals who knew where to look. By the time I reached the small furnished apartment I'd rented under an assumed name, my transformation was complete. The broken librarian who had knelt in the mud at her son's grave had been replaced by something calculating and patient, a predator who understood that the most satisfying revenge requires careful planning and perfect timing. I was arranging Caleb's diary on my new kitchen table when my old phone, still connected despite my canceled service, buzzed with a voicemail notification. Gerald's voice, thick with alcohol and arrogance, filled my empty apartment. "Good riddance, Vivian. We don't need dead weight in this family anyway. Should have cut you loose years ago." He had no idea that 200 miles away his words were being recorded by a woman who no longer existed, while someone much more dangerous began planning how to systematically destroy each member of the family that had murdered her son for wedding money. The furnished studio apartment above Chen's laundromat became my fortress of solitude, a cramped space that smelled perpetually of industrial detergent and fabric softener. The constant rumble of washing machines below provided a mechanical lullaby that masked the sound of my planning sessions, while the steam from the commercial dryers created a humid cocoon that felt appropriate for my metamorphosis from victim to something else entirely. My new reality in Cedar Rapids was deliberately harsh, a self-imposed penance that kept me focused on survival while I built the foundation for my long-term strategy. At Murphy's Diner on First Avenue, I worked double shifts washing dishes for $8 an hour, my hands raw and bleeding from the industrial-strength detergent that stripped away more than just grease from plates. The kitchen's fluorescent lights revealed every crack in my carefully constructed facade, but I welcomed the physical pain because it reminded me that I was still alive when my family had written me off as dead. The night shift cleaning office buildings paid slightly better at $10 an hour, but the work was isolating in ways that sometimes threatened to break my resolve. Moving through empty corporate spaces with my cart of supplies, I would catch glimpses of myself in darkened windows and see a woman I barely recognized. Gone was the soft librarian who had read bedtime stories with infinite patience. In her place stood someone harder, leaner, with eyes that reflected the fluorescent hallway lights like cold steel. Each evening after returning to my studio exhausted and aching, I would sit at my small kitchen table with Caleb's diary spread before me like sacred text. The innocuous observations my son had recorded became my roadmap for understanding the depth of my family's deception, and with each reading, my inner fire burned brighter despite the physical exhaustion weighing down my bones. His childish drawings of Grandpa's work friends and his phonetic spellings of overheard conversations were puzzle pieces that would eventually form a picture of Gerald's true activities. 6 months into my exile, I encountered the first piece of luck that would change everything. I was waiting for the downtown bus after my cleaning shift when a familiar voice called my name from across the street. Martha Rodriguez, my former colleague from the Maplewood Library, was crossing toward me with the kind of shocked recognition that comes from seeing someone you thought had vanished forever. "Vivian. My God, I thought you'd moved away after..." She trailed off clearly, unsure how to reference the tragedy that had driven me from my old life. "What are you doing in Cedar Rapids, so?" Over coffee at an all-night diner near the bus station, I crafted a careful story about needing a fresh start after losing Caleb, keeping my explanation vague enough to avoid suspicion while gathering information about what had happened in Maplewood since my departure. Martha's natural chattiness made her an ideal source of intelligence, and I listened with growing interest as she updated me on various town developments. "You know, the strangest thing happened about a month before Caleb's accident," Martha said, stirring cream into her coffee with the thoughtful expression of someone piecing together a puzzle. "Your father came to the library asking for help with research. He wanted books about insurance law, specifically about beneficiary changes and child policies. I helped him find what he needed, but it struck me as odd, because he kept asking these weird, specific questions." My pulse quickened as I maintained careful neutrality. "What kind of questions?" "Things like how long beneficiary changes take to process whether children's policies could be modified without parental consent, and whether there were any legal challenges to life insurance payouts." Martha continued, unaware that she was providing me with evidence of premeditation that would prove invaluable later. "At the time, I thought maybe he was updating his own policies or helping someone else with estate planning, but given what happened, well, it seems suspicious in hindsight." This revelation transformed my understanding of Gerald's actions from opportunistic theft to calculated murder. He hadn't simply stolen Caleb's insurance money after a tragic accident. He had researched how to steal it beforehand, planning his grandson's financial exploitation months in advance. The cold calculation required for such planning made my family's betrayal infinitely more sinister. My psychological evolution accelerated after this conversation with Martha. Where I had once cried myself to sleep, I now spent my evenings studying legal websites on the public library's computers, learning about insurance fraud statutes, wrongful death claims, and the criminal penalties for financial crimes against minors. My reflection in bathroom mirrors no longer showed a broken woman avoiding her own gaze. Instead, I stared coldly at the strategist I was becoming, studying the angles of my face that had grown sharper with weight loss and determination. My studio apartment gradually transformed into what I privately called my war room. One wall became covered with photocopied pages from Caleb's diary, their innocent observations now arranged chronologically to reveal patterns of Gerald's suspicious behavior. A timeline stretched across another wall marking significant dates: when David died, when Gerald changed the insurance beneficiary, when Caleb began documenting strange visitors to his grandfather's warehouse, and finally the day of the accident itself. I used colored string to connect related incidents, creating a web of evidence that grew more damning with each addition. Yellow string linked Gerald's library research to the insurance change. Red string connected Caleb's observations about mysterious phone calls to specific dates when large deposits appeared in public records I'd requested. Blue string traced the timeline of wedding planning expenses that exceeded Selena's known income. The woman who emerged from this year of systematic planning bore little resemblance to the naive librarian who had trusted her family's intentions. I had learned to compartmentalize grief into fuel for justice, to transform maternal love into strategic thinking, and to channel my rage into patience that would serve me better than any immediate confrontation. During one of our irregular coffee meetings, Martha studied my face with the concern of someone who recognized dangerous changes in an old friend. "Vivian, I know you're still processing everything that happened, but I might know someone who could help you get real answers about your father's activities." She reached into her purse and produced a business card for Jake Morrison, private investigator, with an address in downtown Cedar Rapids and a phone number that seemed to promise the professional expertise I'd been craving. "He owes me a favor from when I helped him research a case last year," Martha said quietly, sliding the card across the table. And based on what I remember about your father's research requests, I think your family has bigger secrets than just stolen money. I called Jake Morrison's number 3 days after my coffee with Martha, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to set in motion. His voice was gravelly and professional when he answered the tone of someone accustomed to receiving calls from desperate people with complicated problems. When I mentioned Martha's referral and briefly outlined my situation, he suggested meeting at a truck stop diner on Highway 30, explaining that he preferred neutral locations for initial consultations where sensitive information might be discussed. The Flying J truck stop sat at the intersection of two major highways, its parking lot filled with 18-wheelers and travelers who minded their own business. Inside the attached diner, Jake Morrison was exactly what I'd expected from his voice, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the watchful eyes of someone who'd spent decades observing human behavior professionally. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but something in his posture suggested law enforcement training that civilian clothes couldn't disguise. "Martha tells me you have concerns about your family's financial activities," he said, after we'd ordered coffee, his directness refreshing after months of navigating careful conversations. "She mentioned insurance issues and some unusual circumstances surrounding your son's death." I placed Caleb's diary on the table between us, watching Jake's expression shift from polite interest to sharp focus as I explained how my 7-year-old had unknowingly documented suspicious family activities in the months before his death. Jake opened the small notebook with the careful handling of someone who understood that evidence could be fragile, and I watched his face grow increasingly grim as he read through my son's innocent observations. "This kid was documenting things he didn't understand," Jake said after studying several pages, his finger tracing Caleb's careful drawings of license plates and unfamiliar faces. "But these aren't random observations. They're systematic surveillance notes. Look at the consistency here, dates times physical descriptions, even attempted recordings of conversations. Your son had natural investigative instincts." The pride I felt hearing those words was immediately overshadowed by the implications of what Jake was suggesting. Caleb hadn't just been a curious child. He'd been an unwitting intelligence gatherer in a situation dangerous enough that adults had felt the need to silence him permanently. Jake photographed relevant pages from the diary with professional equipment, explaining that he would need time to research the individuals and activities Caleb had documented. He quoted me a daily rate that would require careful budgeting from my dishwashing and cleaning wages. But Martha had been right about him owing her a favor. He agreed to begin with preliminary research at no charge with payment required only if he uncovered evidence worth pursuing. 1 week later, Jake returned to the same diner carrying a manila folder thick enough to suggest he'd discovered far more than either of us had anticipated. His expression was darker than during our first meeting, and he waited until our waitress was out of earshot before opening the folder and spreading documents across our table. "Your father has 3 secret bank accounts in the Cayman Islands." Jake began without preamble, showing me printouts of financial records that made my head spin with their complexity. The total balance across all accounts is approximately $2.3 million. The deposits date back nearly 20 years, with the largest transfers occurring after deaths in your extended family. I stared at the numbers, trying to process the scope of Gerald's deception. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was systematic financial predation spanning decades. "There's more," Jake continued, pulling out additional documents. "Your mother has been transferring money to an account in Selena's name for 2 years. Small amounts that wouldn't trigger banking alerts, but they total nearly $150,000. And I found insurance policies on other family members dating back decades that your father controls as beneficiary." The pattern Jake revealed was horrifying in its methodical nature. Gerald had been collecting life insurance payouts on distant relatives, elderly neighbors, and family friends for 20 years, always managing to position himself as beneficiary through various legal manipulations. Caleb's policy wasn't an isolated incident of grief-driven greed. It was the latest transaction in a multi-decade business model that treated human lives as investment opportunities. "Your son's death wasn't about wedding money," Jake said quietly, studying my face for signs that I could handle what he was about to reveal. It was part of your father's long-term financial strategy. He's been using family members as assets, systematically changing beneficiaries, and collecting on policies whenever someone dies. The wedding was just convenient timing. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as Jake showed me a timeline he'd constructed from public records and financial documents. Gerald's pattern was consistent. Identify vulnerable family members or friends, gain their trust during difficult periods, convince them to add him as beneficiary for estate planning purposes, then wait for natural death, or in some cases actively encourage risky behaviors that might accelerate the timeline. The evidence suggested that Gerald had perfected a system of financial predation that operated just within legal boundaries, while exploiting emotional vulnerabilities and family loyalty. He wasn't just a grandfather who'd stolen his grandson's insurance money. He was a serial predator who'd built his wealth on the systematic exploitation of people who trusted him. How many others? I asked, my voice barely audible. At least 12 confirmed payouts over the past 20 years, Jake replied, consulting his notes. Your cousin Tommy, who died in that farming accident in 2018, your great-aunt Helen, who passed from cancer in 2015, several family friends whose deaths seemed natural but occurred shortly after naming your father as beneficiary. The total amount he's collected is probably closer to $4 million. The scope of Gerald's crimes was staggering, but what made my hands tremble with rage was the realization that Caleb had begun documenting evidence of this operation in his innocent diary. My son had unknowingly threatened a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise simply by being observant and writing down what he saw. Jake leaned forward, his expression growing even more serious as he reached for one final envelope he'd kept separate from the other documents. There's something else, and it's the reason I think your son was murdered rather than just exploited after his death. He slid the manila envelope across the table, and something in his eyes warned me that whatever was inside would change everything I thought I knew about that terrible day at the hospital. Hospital records show Caleb was alive for 3 hours after the accident with injuries that were serious but survivable according to the trauma surgeon's initial assessment, Jake said quietly. But someone signed a DNR order to prevent life-saving surgery, and the signature authorization came at a time when you were sedated and unable to give consent. I stared at the manila envelope in Jake's hands, knowing that whatever was inside would fundamentally alter my understanding of that horrific night at St. Mary's Hospital. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, and Jake's expression grew even more somber as he began explaining what his investigation had uncovered about the final hours of my son's life. I obtained Caleb's complete medical records through a contact in hospital administration, Jake said, pulling out official documents stamped with St. Mary's letterhead. Your son arrived at the emergency room conscious and responsive. The initial trauma assessment by Dr. Elizabeth Santos shows that while his injuries were severe, they were absolutely survivable with immediate surgical intervention. I read the clinical notes with growing horror, seeing my son's condition described in medical terminology that stripped away all emotion while revealing the stark truth. Multiple contusions, internal bleeding, possible skull fracture, but Dr. Santos had written in clear handwriting, patient conscious upon arrival, responding to verbal commands, recommend immediate surgical intervention with 85% survival probability pending family consent. Caleb was awake when the ambulance brought him in. Jake continued, his voice gentle but relentless in its delivery of facts I needed to hear. He asked the paramedics about you wanted to know if his mommy was coming. The nurse's notes indicate he remained conscious for nearly 2 hours before the anesthesia for his first surgery. The image of my son lying in that emergency room, scared and asking for me while I was trapped in traffic, desperately trying to reach him, nearly shattered what remained of my composure. But Jake wasn't finished revealing the scope of my family's betrayal. At 2:47 a.m., a do not resuscitate order was filed with the hospital administrator, Jake said, showing me paperwork that made my blood run cold. The signature authorizes the hospital to cease all life-saving measures and allow natural death to occur. It was signed by someone claiming to have medical power of attorney as your son's grandfather. The DNR form showed Gerald's signature bold and confident next to a timestamp that I remembered with crystal clarity. At 2:47 a.m., I had been unconscious in the waiting room, heavily sedated with grief medication that the hospital social worker had insisted I take after hours of hysterical sobbing. I had been completely incapacitated when someone claiming to represent my wishes had condemned my son to death. I had handwriting analysis done on this signature. Jake continued, producing additional documents that confirmed my worst suspicions. It's definitely your father's handwriting, but here's what makes this premeditated murder rather than panicked decision-making. Jake showed me security footage screenshots that he'd somehow obtained from the hospital's surveillance system. The timestamp showed Gerald arriving at St. Mary's at 2:15 a.m., not rushing toward the family waiting area where I was sleeping, but heading directly to the administrative offices. The images captured him in conversation with the night administrator, pointing to documents and appearing calm and businesslike, rather than displaying the panic of a grandfather whose grandchild was dying. 17 minutes later, the DNR paperwork was officially filed. Jake said, his voice taking on the flat tone of a detective presenting evidence. Your father spoke with the administrator for exactly 17 minutes, during which time he convinced hospital staff that you were too emotionally compromised to make rational medical decisions and that he had legal authority to act on your son's behalf. The calculated nature of Gerald's actions hit me like physical blows. While I had been destroyed by grief and sedated into unconsciousness, my father had been methodically ensuring that my son would die regardless of his medical condition or chances for recovery. This wasn't a grandfather making a difficult decision during a family crisis. This was a predator eliminating a witness who threatened his financial operation. I felt something fundamental break inside my chest as the full weight of this revelation settled over me. My son hadn't died from his injuries. He had been murdered by his own grandfather while his mother lay unconscious just 50 feet away. Every moment I'd spent grieving what I thought was a tragic accident had actually been mourning a calculated execution. They didn't just steal from him, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the diner's ambient noise. They murdered him. I don't remember leaving the truck stop or driving back to my apartment. The next thing I was consciously aware of was standing in my studio surrounded by the wreckage of my carefully organized war room. I had destroyed everything in a rage I couldn't remember experiencing, throwing furniture against walls, tearing down my timeline, and evidence boards, screaming until my throat was raw and neighbors were pounding on my door. When the police arrived in response to noise complaints, they found me sitting calmly in the center of the destruction, staring at Caleb's photograph, while my hands bled from glass cuts I didn't remember receiving. The officers seemed to recognize the aftermath of psychological trauma, speaking gently as they verified I wasn't a danger to myself or others before leaving me alone with my devastation. For 48 hours, I sat motionless in that destroyed apartment, staring at my son's face in the photograph and replaying every detail Jake had revealed. My mind cycled through the timeline obsessively. Caleb arriving conscious at the hospital, asking for his mommy, undergoing preliminary treatment while I fought traffic to reach him, then dying unnecessarily because his grandfather needed him. Silenced. The grief that had sustained me for over a year transformed into something infinitely colder and more dangerous. This wasn't about stolen insurance money anymore. This was about a man who had looked at his 7-year-old grandson and decided that murder was preferable to exposure of his criminal enterprise. On the third day, Jake called my prepaid phone with news that completed the picture of Gerald's monstrous calculation. I've been analyzing your son's diary entries more carefully, he said without preamble, cross-referencing them with financial records and police reports from the past 2 years. The DNR wasn't just about the insurance money, Vivian. I listened in silence as Jake explained what Caleb had unknowingly documented in his innocent observations. Gerald needed Caleb dead because the boy witnessed something that could send your father to prison for life, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Your son didn't just see suspicious visitors and overhear phone calls. He documented evidence of a murder that Gerald committed 18 months ago, and he was starting to ask questions that would have led investigators directly to your father's door. Jake met me at my rebuilt apartment 2 days after his phone call, carrying Caleb's diary and a stack of documents that would finally reveal the full scope of what my innocent son had unknowingly witnessed. I had spent those 48 hours reconstructing my war room with methodical precision, channeling my rage into systematic organization that would serve my ultimate goal of justice. "We need to go through your son's entries like a cipher," Jake said, spreading the diary pages across my kitchen table alongside financial records and surveillance photos. What looked like innocent childhood observations were actually detailed documentation of a sophisticated money laundering operation. Together we began decoding my 7-year-old's careful notations with the understanding that each entry represented a piece of evidence that had ultimately cost him his life. When Caleb wrote, "Grandpa had angry phone calls about money people," Jake showed me phone records indicating Gerald received multiple calls from numbers traced to known organized crime figures in Chicago and Kansas City during those exact time frames. Strange men came to Grandpa's warehouse, corresponded with delivery schedules that Jake had uncovered through his surveillance of Gerald's storage facility on the outskirts of Maplewood. My son had been documenting the arrival of unmarked trucks carrying what Gerald claimed were antique furniture shipments for his legitimate side business, but Jake's investigation revealed something far more sinister. The warehouse operation was elaborate in its simplicity. Gerald purchased genuine antique pieces at estate sales and auctions, then used them as vehicles for laundering drug money flowing through Iowa from Mexican cartels to East Coast distribution networks. A Victorian armoire purchased for $500 would be restored in Gerald's warehouse, during which process bundles of cash would be hidden in specially constructed compartments. The piece would then be sold to carefully vetted buyers for $15,000, with the inflated price representing cleaned money entering legitimate financial systems. "Grandpa told me never tell Mommy about the big boxes," took on chilling significance when Jake showed me customs documents indicating Gerald's warehouse received monthly shipments from overseas suppliers who didn't exist. These phantom shipments provided paper trails for large cash deposits that were actually drug proceeds being integrated into Gerald's antique business accounts. Caleb had inadvertently documented license plate numbers, delivery times, and even attempted phonetic spellings of conversations he'd overheard during visits to his grandfather's warehouse. His innocent curiosity had created a comprehensive record of criminal activity that would have been invaluable to federal investigators if anyone had realized what they were reading. "Your father was using Caleb's college fund as his primary business account," Jake explained, showing me bank records that made my stomach turn. The legitimate antique sales provided cover for depositing millions in drug money over the past 3 years. Total illegal transactions probably exceed $5 million. The scope of Gerald's operation explained why he'd felt comfortable stealing Caleb's insurance money. It was insignificant compared to the millions flowing through his laundering enterprise. But my son's detailed observations had created an unexpected vulnerability that threatened the entire criminal network. "The murder wasn't Gerald's idea initially," Jake said, his voice taking on the grim tone of someone delivering news that would shatter whatever remained of my faith in human nature. "I've been monitoring communications between your father and his associates. 3 weeks before Caleb's accident, Gerald received what amounts to a kill order." Jake showed me transcripts of intercepted phone calls where Gerald's criminal partners had learned about the kid who's always hanging around asking questions and drawing pictures. Someone had noticed Caleb's presence during sensitive meetings and correctly identified him as a potential witness who could compromise the entire operation. "Your father was given a choice," Jake continued relentlessly. "Either eliminate the witness himself, or his associates would handle the problem in ways that might also implicate other family members. Gerald chose to sacrifice his own grandson rather than face prosecution or endanger his money laundering business." The phone calls Jake had intercepted revealed Gerald's cold calculation in planning Caleb's murder. He had researched traffic patterns on Maple Street, identified the morning delivery schedule for the truck that would strike my son, and even practiced the route Caleb walked to school to ensure optimal timing for what would appear to be a tragic accident. The truck driver was never charged because witnesses confirmed he couldn't have avoided the collision, Jake explained. Your son stepped directly into traffic at precisely the moment that would ensure maximum impact. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Gerald had spent weeks studying my son's routine, calculating angles and speeds, determining exactly when and where to position himself to push a 7-year-old boy into the path of an oncoming delivery truck. The accident that had destroyed my world was actually a carefully orchestrated execution carried out by a grandfather against his own grandchild to protect a criminal enterprise worth millions. I sat in stunned silence as Jake revealed the final pieces of evidence that proved Gerald's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Security footage from nearby businesses showed my father's car parked on Maple Street at the exact time of the accident, despite his claims to police that he'd been at home. Cell phone tower data placed his phone at the intersection where Caleb died, contradicting his alibi testimony. The DNR order was just the finishing touch, Jake said quietly. Even if your son had survived the initial impact, your father was prepared to ensure he never regained consciousness to tell anyone what he'd witnessed at that warehouse. My transformation from grieving mother to calculating predator was complete in that moment. Gerald hadn't just stolen money from his grandson's corpse. He had systematically planned and executed the murder of an innocent child to protect his criminal empire. The man who should have been Caleb's protector had instead become his executioner. Jake was organizing the evidence files when his phone rang with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. His expression darkened as he listened to whoever was calling, occasionally glancing at me with growing concern. "We have a problem," he said after ending the call. "Someone's been asking questions about you in Cedar Rapids, showing your photo around downtown businesses and the diner where you work. Your family just hired their own private investigator to find you, and based on the description my contact provided, they're using someone with serious resources and no ethical boundaries." The knowledge that my family had hired professional help to track me down transformed my cautious planning into urgent action. Jake and I agreed that I needed to disappear completely while building the resources necessary to destroy Gerald's criminal empire and expose the truth about Caleb's murder. The scared librarian who had fled Maplewood 18 months earlier was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that justice required both patience and power. My first strategic move was to weaponize the very intelligence that had cost my son his life. Using the detailed information Jake had gathered about Gerald's money laundering operation, I began making anonymous tips to federal authorities through carefully crafted letters mailed from different cities across Iowa. I provided specific details about truck schedules, bank account numbers, and the warehouse location without revealing how I'd obtained the information. Within weeks, I noticed increased federal surveillance around Gerald's operations, forcing him to scale back his activities and reduce his income stream significantly. While federal investigators slowly built their case, I used my modest savings to make strategic investments in legitimate businesses that directly competed with Gerald's antique front company. I purchased shares in estate sale companies that specialized in authentic vintage furniture, providing them with insider information about Gerald's inflated pricing strategies. My goal wasn't immediate profit, but long-term disruption of his money laundering capabilities. My evenings after dishwashing shifts became intensive education sessions where I taught myself business law, accounting principles, and corporate strategy through online courses offered by community colleges across the Midwest. I studied forensic accounting techniques, learned to read financial statements, and memorized the legal requirements for proving money laundering in federal court. Knowledge became my primary weapon, and I accumulated it with the same systematic dedication that had once driven my library cataloging work. Building a network of professional allies required careful vetting and strategic recruitment. I found Lisa Wong through online forums for forensic accountants, where her posts about detecting financial crimes impressed me with their technical sophistication and ethical clarity. During our initial coffee meeting in Des Moines, I presented her with sanitized versions of Gerald's financial records, claiming they belonged to a family friend whose suspicious activities concerned me. Lisa's immediate recognition of money laundering patterns confirmed both her expertise and her willingness to pursue justice, regardless of personal connections. David Kim entered my network through a referral from Lisa, his reputation as a white-collar crime attorney preceding our introduction. Unlike the rural lawyers I'd known in Maplewood, David had prosecuted organized crime cases in Chicago before establishing his private practice. When I eventually revealed the true scope of Gerald's activities, David's response was immediate and decisive. "This isn't just money laundering, it's RICO territory. Your father is operating a criminal enterprise." Tommy Chen, the tech specialist who would prove invaluable for electronic surveillance, was Martha's nephew visiting Cedar Rapids during his college break. His casual mention of ethical hacking skills during a family dinner led to a private conversation where I carefully probed his willingness to use those abilities for justice rather than profit. Tommy's moral flexibility, combined with his genuine outrage upon learning about Caleb's murder, made him the perfect digital infiltrator for my growing operation. Each ally was recruited through careful evaluation of their professional capabilities, personal ethics, and psychological motivations. Lisa was driven by her hatred of financial predators who exploited trust. David sought redemption after losing a high-profile case against organized crime in Chicago. Tommy channeled his computer skills toward causes that satisfied his sense of justice. I bound them together through shared purpose while maintaining operational security that protected all of us from Gerald's likely retaliation. My studio apartment underwent complete transformation into a command center that would have impressed professional intelligence operations. One wall displayed a comprehensive timeline of Gerald's criminal activities dating back 20 years, with color-coded entries for confirmed kills, suspected murders, and financial crimes. A second wall tracked my family's current activities through photographs Tommy obtained by hacking their social media accounts and electronic communications. The surveillance network I established was comprehensive and invisible. Lisa's forensic accounting skills revealed hidden patterns in my family's spending that indicated continued criminal income despite federal pressure. David's legal contacts provided updates on the federal investigation's progress and potential timeline for arrests. Tommy's electronic monitoring gave me real-time access to their phone conversations, text messages, and email communications. I photographed my family members from concealed positions during their weekly routines, building detailed profiles of their vulnerabilities and pressure points. Gerald's gambling addiction had worsened under federal scrutiny, creating debts that made him increasingly desperate. Margaret's social standing in church and community provided leverage points for public humiliation. Selena's upcoming wedding represented a massive financial investment that could be weaponized against her if necessary. The intelligence I gathered revealed a family structure rotting from within, held together only by shared culpability in criminal activities and mutual dependence on Gerald's illegal income. Their text message conversations showed growing paranoia about federal investigations, increasing arguments about money management, and rising suspicions that someone was feeding information to authorities. My comprehensive surveillance also revealed something that would change everything: Emily's frequent visits to pediatric oncologists in Des Moines, always accompanied by Selena, who appeared increasingly distressed after each appointment. Tommy's hacking of medical appointment systems confirmed my worst fears about what those visits meant. 18 months after beginning my systematic campaign against Gerald's criminal empire, I received the phone call that would accelerate my timeline beyond anything I'd planned. David's voice was grim as he delivered news from his contacts in the medical community that would force me to make an impossible choice between justice and mercy. "Vivian, there's something you need to know about your niece, Emily," he said without preamble. "She's been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia and needs a bone marrow transplant immediately. According to the hospital records Tommy accessed, you're the only family match in the donor registry." David's words about Emily's leukemia diagnosis hit me like a physical blow. But within seconds, my strategic mind was already calculating the implications of this devastating news. A 5-year-old child was dying, and according to the medical records Tommy had accessed, I was her only hope for survival. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine intervention. The family that had murdered my son for money now needed me to save theirs. The medical details David provided were stark and unforgiving. Emily had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 3 weeks earlier, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly despite aggressive chemotherapy treatments at Children's Hospital in Des Moines. The oncology team had searched the National Bone Marrow Registry for compatible donors, but found no matches among the millions of registered volunteers. Within her immediate family, preliminary testing had ruled out Selena Marcus and both grandparents as potential donors. The doctors estimate she has 6 to 8 weeks before her condition becomes irreversible. David continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the moral complexity of what he was telling me. Without a bone marrow transplant, Emily will die, and you're literally her only chance for survival. I absorbed this information with the cold calculation that had replaced my capacity for spontaneous emotion. My 18 months of systematic planning had prepared me for many scenarios, but I had never anticipated that my family's desperation would hand me such absolute leverage. They had viewed Caleb as a financial asset to be liquidated. Now they would have to beg for their own child's life from the woman they had tried to destroy. Tommy's electronic surveillance confirmed that my family had been frantically searching for me since Emily's diagnosis. Their text message conversations revealed growing panic as medical professionals explained that finding me wasn't just important, it was Emily's only chance for survival. Gerald had hired 3 different private investigators, each more expensive and aggressive than the last, while Selena had posted desperate appeals on social media begging me to contact the family. The confrontation I had been planning for months finally came on a Tuesday evening as I was closing the kitchen at Riverside Bistro, where I had worked my way up to assistant manager through sheer determination and strategic competence. I was reviewing inventory sheets when Jake called to warn me that my family's current private investigator had been seen in the restaurant's parking lot, apparently waiting for my shift to end. I walked outside to find Gerald, Margaret, and Selena standing beside a rental car, their faces bearing the hollow desperation of people who had exhausted every other option. They looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of federal investigation pressure and the crushing weight of their daughter's terminal diagnosis. Gerald's usually confident posture had collapsed into the hunched shoulders of a man facing consequences he couldn't manipulate or buy his way out of. The moment they saw me, their transformation was immediate and complete. Gerald, who had called me dead weight in his final voicemail, dropped to his knees on the asphalt parking lot without hesitation. Margaret and Selena followed his lead, the 3 of them kneeling before me like supplicants seeking mercy from a deity they had spent years insulting. "Vivian, please." Selena sobbed, her designer clothes stained with tears, and her perfectly styled hair disheveled from days of hospital vigils. "Emily is dying, and you're the only one who can save her. We'll do anything, give you anything, just please help our little girl." Margaret's voice joined her daughter's shaking with the kind of fear that comes from watching a grandchild waste away while being powerless to help. "We know we hurt you terribly, and we know you have every right to hate us, but Emily is innocent in all of this. She doesn't deserve to die for our mistakes." Gerald remained silent, but his presence on his knees spoke volumes about how completely the situation had reversed our family's power dynamics. The man who had orchestrated my son's murder for financial gain was now prostrating himself before his victim, begging for the very mercy he had denied Caleb in that hospital room. I looked down at them with eyes that felt like ice, my heart completely unmoved by their theatrical display of desperation. They killed my son for money. Now they need me to save theirs. I thought, savoring the perfect symmetry of justice that fate had delivered into my hands. Every tear they shed, every desperate plea they uttered, only reinforced my absolute power over their family's survival. "You called me dead weight," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the parking lot with deadly calm. "You said Caleb was just a kid who would have been expensive anyway. You stole his insurance money for a wedding reception and laughed about how it matched your dress colors." Selena's sobbing intensified as I recited their cruelties back to them, but I felt no satisfaction in her pain, only cold recognition that this moment represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward for 18 months. "Emily is 5 years old," Margaret gasped between sobs. "The same age Caleb was when he used to play with her at family dinners." Please don't let an innocent child pay for what we did." The comparison to Caleb was either brilliantly calculated or devastatingly naive, but it only strengthened my resolve. They had viewed my son as expendable when it served their financial interests. Now they expected me to prioritize their child's life over the justice Caleb deserved. I stood in silence for several minutes watching them kneel in the parking lot while restaurant employees and customers walked past, witnessing their complete humiliation. This was the moment I had dreamed about during countless sleepless nights, seeing the people who had destroyed my world reduced to begging for mercy. They had never shown my family. "I'll save Emily's life," I said finally, my voice cutting through their sobs like a blade. The relief that flooded their faces was immediately extinguished by my next words. "But first, each of you will confess publicly to murdering my son." The shocked silence that followed my ultimatum stretched across the restaurant parking lot like a physical presence. My family remained on their knees, but their expressions had shifted from desperate hope to horrified comprehension as they realized I wasn't offering simple forgiveness in exchange for saving Emily's life. I was demanding complete destruction of their reputations and public acknowledgement of their crimes. "You want us to confess to murder?" Gerald whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Vivian, we never intended for Caleb to die. The accident was you pushing him into traffic." I cut him off, my voice carrying the authority of someone who held absolute power over the situation. "But we'll start with the crimes you're willing to admit. Gerald, you will appear in court and confess to forging the DNR order and stealing Caleb's insurance money. You'll detail exactly how you changed the beneficiary while I was grieving David's death." I turned to my mother, whose face had gone pale as she began understanding the scope of what I was demanding. "Margaret, you will stand before your church congregation this Sunday and admit that you approved letting your grandson die for financial gain. You'll explain to every person who respected you that you chose money over a child's life." Finally, I looked at Selena, whose designer makeup was streaking down her cheeks in dark rivulets. "And you will publicly acknowledge that you stole from a dead child, wore his handmade necklace to your wedding like a trophy, and used his death benefits to fund your reception. You'll return every penny with interest, and you'll do it in front of everyone who attended that wedding." The specific requirements I outlined grew more detailed as I watched their faces register the full implications of my demands. Each confession had to be videotaped with professional equipment, witnessed by multiple credible parties, and submitted to both local media and law enforcement agencies. There would be no private apologies or quiet acknowledgments. Their crimes against Caleb would be exposed with the same public humiliation they had inflicted on me. "This is insane!" Selena gasped, struggling to her feet despite my obvious expectation that she remain kneeling. "You're asking us to destroy our entire lives, our reputations, everything we've worked for. There has to be another way to handle this." "Emily doesn't have a time for negotiations," I replied coldly. "Every day you spend trying to minimize your confessions is another day closer to her death. I suggest you decide quickly whether your reputations are more important than your daughter's life." Gerald attempted to regain some semblance of control through intimidation, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used to manipulate family dynamics for decades. "You're making a mistake, Vivian. You don't understand the consequences of pushing us too far. There are people involved in my business who don't appreciate public attention." His threat confirmed what Jake's investigation had already revealed about Gerald's criminal associates, but it also provided me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate just how completely I controlled this situation. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to photographs Tommy had taken of federal surveillance teams watching Gerald's warehouse. "You mean the people who ordered you to kill Caleb because he was documenting their money laundering operation?" I asked, showing him images of FBI agents positioned outside his business. "Your criminal friends are too busy avoiding federal prosecution to worry about family confessions. In fact, public admissions of guilt might actually help them by making you look like a rogue operator rather than part of their organization." The family's resistance began crumbling as they realized I possessed detailed knowledge of crimes they thought were secret. Margaret was the first to break completely, her maternal instincts overriding her concern for social standing as Emily's condition continued deteriorating. "I'll do it," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the parking lot's ambient noise. "I'll confess at Sunday service if you'll immediately begin the transplant procedures. Emily can't wait much longer." Her capitulation created visible panic in Gerald and Selena as they realized the family's united front was dissolving. If Margaret confessed publicly, her admission would implicate them in ways that made their own denials impossible to maintain. The careful coordination that had protected them for 18 months was unraveling under the pressure of Emily's medical crisis. "Mom, you can't seriously be considering this," Selena protested, grabbing Margaret's arm as if physical contact could restore her mother's resistance to my demands. "If you confess to approving Caleb's death, they'll arrest all of us. Think about what you're saying." "I am thinking." Margaret snapped back, yanking her arm free with surprising force. "I'm thinking about Emily dying while we argue about protecting ourselves from consequences we deserve. I won't let another grandchild die because of this family's selfishness." The shift in family dynamics was exactly what I had anticipated and carefully engineered. By forcing them to choose between individual self-preservation and collective survival, I was exploiting the same greed and selfishness that had destroyed my son. Each family member would eventually prioritize their own interests over group loyalty, making coordinated resistance impossible. Gerald's attempts to maintain control became increasingly desperate as he realized his authority over the family was evaporating. "If we all stick together and refuse her demands, she'll have to save Emily anyway. She's not heartless enough to let an innocent child die for revenge." "Are you willing to bet your granddaughter's life on that assumption?" I asked quietly, my voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had already made peace with difficult choices. "Because I've had 18 months to consider what justice looks like, and Emily's survival depends entirely on your willingness to acknowledge what you did to Caleb." The medical urgency that drove their desperation was my greatest advantage in these negotiations. Unlike financial or legal pressures that could be delayed or appealed, Emily's leukemia operated on a biological timeline that left no room for extended bargaining. Every hour they spent trying to minimize their confessions brought their daughter closer to irreversible decline. Margaret's decision to confess first created a domino effect that would ultimately force the others to follow her lead, or watch Emily die while maintaining their denials. She understood what Gerald and Selena had not yet accepted. My demands were not negotiable, and their only choice was between public humiliation and their child's death. As we stood in that parking lot finalizing the arrangements for Margaret's Sunday confession, Gerald's phone buzzed with an urgent notification that would accelerate our timeline beyond what any of us had anticipated. His face went white as he read the message, and I watched his remaining composure crumble completely. "What is it?" Selena demanded, but Gerald was already forwarding the message to both women with shaking fingers. The notification was from his attorney. "The IRS Criminal Investigation Division has opened an official inquiry into your financial activities. Federal agents will be serving warrants on your residence and business properties within 48 hours. The federal warrant notice transformed our parking lot negotiations into a race against time that would accelerate every aspect of my revenge timeline. Margaret understood that with federal agents preparing to raid Gerald's properties within 48 hours, her window for voluntary confession was rapidly closing. We agreed that she would make her public admission at St. Mark's Lutheran Church during the 11 o'clock service that Sunday, giving us exactly 36 hours to prepare for what would become the most devastating moment in our small town's recent memory. I arrived at the church early that morning, positioning myself in the balcony section where I could observe Margaret's confession without being easily recognized by congregants who might remember me from my previous life in Maplewood. The sanctuary was packed beyond its normal capacity, as word had somehow spread through the community that something significant was going to happen during the service. I suspected Margaret herself had inadvertently generated the larger crowd through her obvious distress during the past week, prompting curious neighbors and concerned church members to attend. Margaret sat in the front pew with Selena beside her, both women appearing pale and hollow-eyed from sleepless nights spent wrestling with the choice between Emily's survival and their own reputations. Gerald was notably absent, having claimed illness when church members called to check on the family's well-being. His cowardice was predictable but still disappointing. I had hoped to witness his reaction to his wife's public destruction of their carefully maintained facade. Pastor Williams conducted the first portion of the service with his usual gentle authority, leading hymns and prayers, while remaining oblivious to the bomb that was about to detonate in his sanctuary. When he invited congregants to share testimonies or prayer requests, Margaret rose from her pew with the mechanical movements of someone operating on pure willpower rather than conscious decision-making. The sanctuary fell into expectant silence as she approached the podium, her normally steady voice trembling as she gripped the wooden lectern for support. "I need to confess something to this congregation and ask for God's forgiveness for the most terrible sin I've ever committed," she began, her words carrying clearly through the church's excellent acoustics. What followed was 18 minutes of devastating honesty that stripped away every pretense of respectability Margaret had spent decades building. She confessed to approving the DNR order that had killed her grandson, explaining in clinical detail how she and Gerald had chosen insurance money over Caleb's life, while I lay sedated and helpless in the hospital waiting room. Her voice broke repeatedly as she described the calculated nature of their decision, the way they had viewed my son as a financial asset, rather than a beloved family member. The congregation's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of horror echoed through the sanctuary as longtime friends processed the magnitude of what they were hearing. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught Sunday school with Margaret for 15 years, began crying openly in the third pew. The Johnson family, whose own grandchildren had played with Caleb at church functions, gathered their children and walked out in obvious disgust halfway through the confession. "I let my grandson die for money," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as she reached the confession's climax. "I chose greed over love, and I've destroyed the most innocent member of our family for financial gain that I didn't even need. I stand before you as someone who has betrayed every value this church has taught me." By the time she finished speaking, nearly a third of the congregation had left the building, their departure creating a shuffle of footsteps and whispered conversations that provided devastating commentary on the community's judgment. Those who remained sat in stunned silence, staring at a woman they had respected for decades, while trying to reconcile her confession with their memories of her previous character. The social destruction that followed Margaret's confession was swift and absolute. Within hours of the service ending, her phone began ringing with calls from organizations where she had volunteered for decades. The hospital auxiliary revoked her membership that afternoon. The church quilting circle, which she had led for 8 years, unanimously voted to expel her on Monday morning. The Garden Club, the Historical Society, and the Library Board all followed suit by Tuesday, systematically erasing her presence from every social institution that had defined her identity. Former friends crossed the street to avoid encountering her during grocery shopping trips. Neighbors who had chatted over backyard fences for 20 years suddenly found urgent indoor tasks whenever she appeared in her garden. The social isolation was so complete that by Wednesday, Margaret was crying alone in her empty house while her phone sat silent and her mailbox filled with canceled invitations to events she would never again be welcome to attend. The cruelest blow came from the neighborhood children, who began running from her house while chanting, "The grandma who kills kids," whenever she appeared on her front porch. Their innocent brutality reflected adult conversations they had overheard, transforming Margaret from beloved community elder into the kind of monster parents use to frighten children into good behavior. From my position in the church balcony, I watched Margaret's complete social annihilation with the cold satisfaction of someone witnessing justice, finally served after 18 months of patient planning. "One down, 2 to go," I thought, touching the protection necklace Caleb had made for me, that I now wore hidden beneath my shirt. Caleb is watching from heaven as justice unfolds, and his killer's family is finally paying the price for what they stole from him. I left the church immediately after Margaret's confession, not because I felt sympathy for her devastation, but because I had medical appointments to keep. True to my word, I drove directly to Children's Hospital in Des Moines to begin the bone marrow compatibility testing that would save Emily's life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was racing to preserve the life of one family member while systematically destroying the reputations of the others, but my promise had been clear confessions in exchange for Emily's survival. The medical procedures required for bone marrow donation were more complex than I had anticipated, involving multiple blood tests, physical examinations, and psychological evaluations to ensure I was a suitable donor. Dr. Patricia Santos, the pediatric oncologist overseeing Emily's case, explained that the actual transplant procedure would require several days of preparation injections, followed by the extraction process itself. Emily's condition is critical but stable, Dr. Santos informed me during our initial consultation. With your bone marrow, her survival probability increases to approximately 90%. Without it, she has perhaps 2 weeks before her condition becomes irreversible. That evening, as I returned to my apartment after a full day of medical procedures, my phone rang with Selena's number. Her voice was barely recognizable through sobs and panic as she delivered news that would reshape the final phase of my revenge campaign. "Vivian, something terrible is happening," she gasped, her words tumbling together in hysterical desperation. "Mom's locked herself in the bathroom with a bottle of pills, and she's not responding when we call her name. And Dad just disappeared with 3 suitcases after the federal agents left our house this afternoon." Selena's panicked phone call about Margaret's suicide attempt and Gerald's disappearance confirmed that my systematic destruction of the family was proceeding exactly as I had planned. While she sobbed about finding pill bottles and suicide notes, I was already tracking Gerald's movements through the network Jake and I had established months earlier. My father's cowardice was predictable, but his timing couldn't have been worse for his own survival prospects. Jake's contacts in federal law enforcement had been monitoring Gerald's financial activities since my anonymous tips began reaching the right desks 18 months earlier. When I called to report Gerald's likely flight attempt, Jake confirmed what I had suspected: every offshore account Gerald thought was secret had been frozen by federal order that morning. His carefully hoarded millions in the Cayman Islands were now inaccessible, leaving him with only whatever cash he could carry in those 3 suitcases Selena had mentioned. "He's probably heading for O'Hare," Jake told me during our emergency phone consultation. "My contact at TSA flagged his name this afternoon when he tried to book a private charter to Georgetown. The flight was grounded due to what they're calling customs irregularities, but what that really means is federal agents are waiting for him to make his move." Gerald's failed escape unfolded exactly as Jake had predicted. According to the surveillance reports I received throughout that evening, my father spent 6 hours at Chicago O'Hare Airport, desperately trying to arrange alternative transportation out of the country. He attempted to book commercial flights to Canada, Mexico, and several Caribbean islands, only to discover that his passport had been flagged by federal authorities. The private charter company he'd originally contacted refused to refund his deposit, citing their policy against facilitating flight from federal investigation. By midnight, Gerald was forced to return to Iowa empty-handed and increasingly desperate, his grand escape plan having collapsed due to the very federal investigation I had been feeding with information for over a year. Jake's contacts reported that he'd spent most of the return drive making frantic phone calls to criminal associates who were either unreachable or openly hostile to his attempts to seek help. The federal raid on Gerald's warehouse occurred at dawn the following morning, precisely timed to catch him when he was exhausted from his failed flight attempt and most likely to make mistakes. IRS criminal investigation agents, accompanied by FBI specialists in organized crime, descended on his operation with search warrants that covered every aspect of his money laundering enterprise. I watched the raid unfold from a coffee shop across the street, savoring the sight of federal agents carting away computers, financial records, and boxes of evidence that would prove Gerald's criminal activities beyond any reasonable doubt. The thoroughness of the federal operation reflected the quality of intelligence I had provided through my anonymous tips over the past 18 months. Agents knew exactly where to look for hidden compartments in the antique furniture, which filing cabinets contained financial records, and how to access Gerald's computerized accounting systems. They even discovered the secret room behind a false wall where Gerald stored cash waiting to be laundered through his fake antique sales. Gerald's horror as he watched his criminal empire being systematically dismantled was visible even from my distant observation point. He stood in the warehouse parking lot in handcuffs, his face displaying the kind of shock that comes from realizing someone has been building a case against you for months while you remained completely unaware. When agents led him to a federal vehicle for transport to downtown processing, I could see him scanning the crowd of onlookers, as if searching for the person responsible for his downfall. The criminal associates Gerald had counted on for help proved to be either arrested already or too smart to risk contact with someone under active federal investigation. His desperate phone calls throughout the day reached only voicemails and disconnected numbers, as his former partners in the money laundering operation had either fled or been taken into custody during coordinated raids across 3 states. The criminal network that had protected him for decades had evaporated overnight, leaving him completely isolated and facing federal charges that could result in life imprisonment. Gerald's psychological deterioration accelerated rapidly as he realized the scope of his legal troubles and the impossibility of his situation. Neighbors reported hearing screaming and furniture being thrown inside his house during the afternoon, following his release on federal bond. He began drinking heavily, stumbling through his empty house while making increasingly desperate phone calls to lawyers who either refused to take his case or quoted retainer fees he could no longer afford with his assets frozen. His growing paranoia and rage focused increasingly on me, as he began to understand that his downfall hadn't been coincidental or the result of routine federal investigation. Someone had been systematically feeding information to authorities, someone who knew intimate details about his criminal activities and had been planning his destruction for an extended period. The realization that his missing daughter-in-law might be responsible for orchestrating his ruin sent him into fits of rage that could be heard 3 houses away. By evening, Gerald's desperation had reached levels that made him capable of increasingly irrational decisions. His attempts to contact me through intermediaries had failed, and his lawyers had warned him that any attempt to threaten or intimidate federal witnesses would result in immediate imprisonment pending trial. Margaret remained sedated in the hospital following her suicide attempt, and Selena was too focused on Emily's deteriorating condition to provide the emotional support Gerald needed to maintain his sanity. That night, Gerald made the decision that would provide me with the final confrontation I had been planning since the day I discovered Caleb's true cause of death. Jake's surveillance team reported that Gerald had broken into my old apartment in Maplewood, apparently hoping to find some clue about my current location or evidence he could use to negotiate his way out of federal prosecution. What he found instead was a single piece of paper taped to the living room window, positioned exactly where someone searching the empty apartment would be certain to see it. I had placed it there weeks earlier, anticipating that Gerald's desperation would eventually drive him to take exactly this kind of reckless action. The note was brief but comprehensive in its delivery of the impossible choice I was offering him. "The surgery starts tomorrow. You have 12 hours to confess everything or Emily dies while you rot in federal prison." While Gerald's desperate search through my abandoned apartment was unfolding, Selena's carefully constructed life was simultaneously collapsing under the weight of revelations that had emerged since Margaret's church confession. The domino effect I had orchestrated was proceeding exactly as planned, with each family member's destruction accelerating the other's downfall in a cascade of consequences that would leave none of them unscathed. Marcus's reaction to learning the truth about his fiancée's role in Caleb's death was swift and brutal. The corporate lawyer who had seemed so enamored with Selena's beauty and social connections proved to have moral boundaries that couldn't accommodate marriage to someone who had profited from a child's murder. Their confrontation occurred in the lobby of the law firm where Marcus worked, with his colleagues witnessing Selena's hysterical breakdown as he publicly terminated their engagement. "I want the ring back, all the wedding deposits returned, and every piece of jewelry I've given you over the past 2 years," Marcus announced with the cold precision of someone drafting a legal document. "Our relationship is over, and I'm instructing my bank to freeze the joint account we established for wedding expenses." The engagement ring Selena had proudly displayed throughout their relationship became a symbol of her destroyed future as she was forced to surrender it in full view of Marcus's professional associates. The $35,000 emerald-cut diamond that had represented her escape from small-town limitations was handed over like evidence in a criminal proceeding, with Marcus immediately placing it in his briefcase as if it were contaminated by association with her crimes. The wedding venue cancellation created a cascade of financial disasters that Selena was powerless to prevent. Premier wedding venues demanded immediate payment of cancellation fees totaling $47,000, citing breach of contract when she couldn't provide the funds Gerald had promised to transfer from his now frozen accounts. The catering company, florist, photographer, and string quartet all followed suit with their own demands for payment, creating a mountain of debt that exceeded Selena's annual teaching salary. Her position at Maplewood Elementary School became untenable within days of Margaret's confession as parents began demanding that someone who had profited from a child's death be removed from contact with their own children. The school board, faced with potential lawsuits and community outrage, placed Selena on administrative leave pending a full investigation into her fitness to work with minors. Her teaching license, which represented 15 years of career development, was suspended by the state education department, following complaints from parents and fellow educators. The financial destruction accelerated as credit card companies began canceling her accounts based on reports of her involvement in insurance fraud and potential criminal activity. Her apartment landlord, horrified by the association with someone Margaret had publicly identified as complicit in murder, terminated her lease with 30 days' notice. The carefully maintained credit score that had allowed her to qualify for wedding loans and luxury purchases plummeted as vendors reported her defaults to collection agencies. Within 2 weeks of Margaret's confession, Selena was living in her car in hospital parking lots, her belongings reduced to whatever could fit in her compact sedan. Her desperate phone calls to me increased in frequency and intensity as her situation became more dire, but I maintained strict silence, letting her messages accumulate as evidence of her growing desperation. "Vivian, please. I know you hate me, but I'm sleeping in my car and I haven't eaten in 2 days." One voicemail message pleaded, "I'll do anything you want. Confess to anything, return money I don't have. Just please help me survive this. I can't even afford gas to keep driving to the hospital to see Emily." The cruelest aspect of Selena's destruction was watching it occur while Emily's condition continued deteriorating in the pediatric intensive care unit. Every day Selena spent dealing with bankruptcy proceedings and criminal investigations was another day her daughter moved closer to irreversible decline. The bone marrow transplant procedure I had agreed to perform was scheduled but required extensive preparation time that Emily's medical team warned might exceed her remaining lifespan. Dr. Santos's daily updates painted an increasingly grim picture of Emily's prospects without immediate intervention. The child's white blood cell count was dropping precipitously despite aggressive chemotherapy, and her small body was showing signs of systemic failure that indicated her window for successful transplant was rapidly closing. The medical urgency created pressure that made Selena's financial and social problems seem trivial by comparison, yet those same problems prevented her from focusing entirely on her daughter's care. Selena's psychological breakdown manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that concerned hospital staff and family members alike. She would arrive at Emily's bedside after spending nights in her car unwashed and wearing the same clothes for days, then break into hysterical sobbing that disturbed other patients and families. Her guilt over the connection between her past choices and Emily's current suffering created a feedback loop of self-recrimination that made rational decision-making impossible. "This is my fault," she would whisper to Emily's unconscious form during visiting hours. "Mommy made terrible choices, and now you're paying the price for what I did to your cousin Caleb. I'm so sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry for everything." The hospital's social work department became involved when nurses reported Selena's deteriorating mental state and inability to provide stable living arrangements for Emily's post-transplant care. The child welfare implications of having a homeless, psychologically unstable mother complicated the medical team's planning and added another layer of bureaucratic obstacles to Emily's treatment timeline. Gerald's federal legal troubles meant he couldn't provide financial support for either his daughter or granddaughter, leaving Margaret as the family's only potential resource. However, her own psychiatric hospitalization following the suicide attempt had rendered her legally incompetent to make medical or financial decisions, creating a void in family authority that threatened to delay Emily's treatment indefinitely. The convergence of these crises created exactly the situation I had been working toward for 18 months, a family so completely destroyed by the consequences of their actions that they had no choice but to accept whatever terms I offered for Emily's survival. Their desperation had reached levels that made my demands seem reasonable compared to watching a 5-year-old die while they feuded over responsibility and blame. When Selena finally gathered enough courage to demand direct access to me at Children's Hospital, she discovered the final piece of leverage I had established to ensure her complete compliance with my requirements. Hospital security stopped her at the pediatric ward entrance with news that would complete her psychological destruction. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're on the restricted visitor list," the security guard informed her, checking his computer screen with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Chen has legal guardianship of the patient pending completion of the transplant procedure. You'll need her written permission to visit." The legal guardianship I had established over Emily represented the culmination of 18 months of careful planning and resource accumulation. Through David Kim's legal expertise and my growing financial resources, I had successfully petitioned the court for temporary medical guardianship based on the family's demonstrated inability to make rational decisions in Emily's best interest. The documentation I provided included evidence of Margaret's suicide attempt, Gerald's federal criminal charges, and Selena's homelessness, painting a picture of family dysfunction that made my guardianship appear necessary for the child's protection. Hospital administrators deferred to my authority with the professional courtesy reserved for legal guardians who held ultimate decision-making power over patient care. Dr. Santos consulted with me regarding treatment options, medication schedules, and visitation restrictions while nursing staff implemented my directives about who could and couldn't access Emily's room. The transformation from powerless grieving mother to someone with absolute control over another family's medical crisis felt like cosmic justice finally balancing the scales. My first visit with Emily since gaining guardianship revealed a pale, fragile child who bore little resemblance to the energetic 5-year-old I remembered from family gatherings years earlier. The aggressive chemotherapy had stolen her hair and much of her body weight, leaving her looking ethereal and heartbreakingly vulnerable in the oversized hospital bed surrounded by machines that monitored every aspect of her failing body systems. "Are you the angel lady Mommy talks about?" Emily asked in a whisper-thin voice when I entered her room, her large eyes studying my face with the serious intensity that comes from spending weeks surrounded by adults who speak in hushed, worried tones. "I'm your Aunt Vivian," I replied, sitting carefully beside her bed and taking her small hand in mine. "I'm here to help make you better, but it's going to require some very special medicine that only I can give you." Despite everything her family had done to mine, Emily remained an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of adult crimes and consequences. My genuine care for her welfare wasn't feigned or strategic. She was a child who needed protection, and my ability to save her life represented the one purely good outcome that could emerge from this extended campaign of revenge. The medical procedures required for bone marrow donation began with extensive compatibility testing that confirmed what preliminary results had already indicated I was indeed Emily's best hope for survival. The testing process involved multiple blood draws, bone marrow biopsies, and physical examinations that were uncomfortable but necessary to ensure the transplant would be successful. Dr. Santos explained the bone marrow extraction procedure in clinical detail that made clear why donor recruitment was often challenging. The process would require general anesthesia, while surgeons used large needles to extract bone marrow from my pelvic bones, a procedure that would leave me bedridden for several days and experiencing significant pain during recovery. The physical discomfort I would endure seemed insignificant compared to Emily's suffering, but it also served as a reminder of the power I held over her survival. You understand that as the donor you can withdraw consent at any time up until the actual extraction begins. Dr. Santos informed me during our final consultation. Once we begin the procedure, we're committed to completing it immediately for Emily's safety. But until that moment, you retain complete control over whether the transplant proceeds. This ultimate veto power over Emily's survival gave me leverage that extended far beyond what legal guardianship alone could provide. My family's desperation increased exponentially as they realized I could change my mind at any moment, leaving Emily to die while they remained powerless to influence my decision through threats, bribes, or emotional manipulation. The hospital's security camera system provided me with comprehensive surveillance of my family's increasingly desperate behavior in corridors and waiting areas where they gathered hoping for updates about Emily's condition. Gerald and Selena's argument in the parking lot escalated to physical violence when she blamed him for destroying Emily's chances through his criminal activities, resulting in security intervention, and Gerald being banned from hospital property pending resolution of his federal charges. Margaret's attempts to bribe nursing staff for information about Emily's treatment schedule demonstrated how completely her moral compass had been destroyed by desperation. Security footage showed her offering cash payments to orderlies and maintenance workers, anyone she thought might have access to medical information that could help her regain some influence over her granddaughter's care. Her pathetic efforts to circumvent my authority only reinforced the court's decision to grant me guardianship. Selena's deteriorating mental state was particularly evident in surveillance footage that captured her sleeping in her car in the hospital parking garage, emerging each morning looking increasingly disheveled and unstable. Her attempts to gain unauthorized access to Emily's room resulted in multiple security interventions, with guards eventually instructing her to remain in designated waiting areas or face permanent removal from hospital property. I watched these surveillance recordings from the privacy of my temporary hospital accommodation with the cold satisfaction of someone witnessing justice unfold according to plan. My family's complete powerlessness in the face of Emily's medical crisis represented the same helplessness I had experienced when they destroyed my son's life while I lay sedated and unable to protect him. The reversal of power dynamics was so perfect, it felt like divine intervention rather than strategic planning. The medical team's growing urgency about Emily's condition created additional pressure that accelerated my family's psychological breakdown. Daily consultations with Dr. Santos revealed that Emily's body was showing signs of systemic failure that indicated her window for successful transplant was narrowing rapidly. Each passing day reduced her chances of surviving the procedure itself, even if the bone marrow transplant proceeded perfectly. The hospital's child psychology team had become involved due to Emily's awareness that family conflicts were somehow connected to her medical treatment. She asked increasingly sophisticated questions about why her mother wasn't allowed to visit, why Grandpa Gerald had stopped coming to see her, and whether the angel lady who held the key to her recovery would actually follow through with her promises to help. Emily knows something is wrong beyond just being sick, the child psychologist informed me during one of our consultations. She's picking up on adult stress and family dysfunction in ways that are affecting her emotional state and possibly her physical recovery. The sooner we can resolve the family situation, the better her overall prognosis becomes. The convergence of Emily's deteriorating medical condition with my family's complete social and financial destruction had created exactly the scenario I needed to extract final confessions and complete justice for Caleb's murder. Every additional day of delay brought Emily closer to death while providing me with increased leverage over family members who had no choice but to accept whatever terms I offered. That afternoon, Dr. Santos requested an emergency consultation that would accelerate our timeline beyond what any of us had anticipated. Her expression was grave as she reviewed Emily's latest test results, and I could see in her eyes the kind of concern that comes from watching a young patient slip beyond the point where medical intervention can guarantee success. Mrs. Chen, Emily's condition has deteriorated significantly over the past 24 hours, she said without preamble. We need to complete the transplant immediately, or we're going to lose her within 48 hours. Dr. Santos's 48-hour deadline transformed my carefully orchestrated revenge campaign into a race against Emily's failing biology, forcing me to accelerate Gerald's public confession beyond the timeline I had originally planned. The federal hearing that would provide the perfect venue for his admission of guilt was already scheduled for the following morning, giving me less than 24 hours to ensure that justice for Caleb would be served before I fulfilled my promise to save Emily's life. David Kim's coordination with federal prosecutors had been building toward this moment for weeks, with my anonymously provided evidence creating an overwhelming case against Gerald that made plea negotiations inevitable. The money laundering charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that would effectively guarantee Gerald would die in federal prison, but the prosecutors were willing to recommend reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation that might help them dismantle the larger criminal network he had been serving. They want him to testify against his organized crime contacts, David explained during our emergency strategy session at the hospital. But they're also interested in the insurance fraud and potential murder charges related to your son's death. If Gerald confesses to forging the DNR and deliberately causing Caleb's death, they'll recommend 25 years instead of life without parole. The courtroom at the federal building in Des Moines was packed beyond capacity when Gerald's hearing began at 9 o'clock that morning, with media representatives occupying every available seat after receiving anonymous tips about the significance of the proceedings. I had carefully leaked the hearing schedule to local television stations and newspapers, ensuring that Gerald's confession would receive the maximum possible public exposure and community witness. Gerald entered the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit, his appearance dramatically altered from the confident patriarch who had dominated family dynamics for decades. Federal custody had aged him rapidly, with his gray hair unkempt, and his face bearing the hollow expression of someone who had finally recognized the inevitability of his destruction. His court-appointed attorney, a harried public defender named Robert Chen, who bore no relation to our family, carried a manila folder that contained the plea agreement that would save Gerald from life imprisonment in exchange for complete confession. Judge Patricia Morrison called the hearing to order with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had presided over hundreds of federal criminal cases. But even she seemed surprised by the media attention and packed gallery that suggested this particular plea hearing involved something more significant than routine money laundering charges. Mr. Hale, you understand that by accepting this plea agreement, you are admitting guilt to multiple federal crimes and waiving your right to trial by jury. Judge Morrison began reading from documents that would formalize Gerald's legal destruction. You also understand that your confession today will be recorded and can be used against you in any future legal proceedings. Gerald's voice was barely audible as he confirmed his understanding of the proceedings, his hands shaking as he prepared to deliver the confession that would finally provide justice for my son's murder. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as his attorney prompted him to begin the detailed admission that would destroy whatever remained of his reputation and confirm his guilt before God and community. I forged DNR documents to prevent my grandson Caleb Chen's life-saving surgery because I needed his insurance money to cover gambling debts and maintain my money laundering operation. Gerald said, his voice growing stronger as he accepted the inevitability of his confession. I deliberately caused the death of a 7-year-old child for financial gain, and I have spent the past 18 months lying to my family and community about my responsibility for his murder. The gasps from the gallery were audible throughout the courtroom as community members who had known Gerald for decades processed the magnitude of what they were hearing. Reporters frantically scribbled notes while sketch artists captured Gerald's broken posture and defeated expression for the evening news broadcasts that would spread his confession throughout the state. I sat in the front row of the gallery directly in Gerald's line of sight, making deliberate eye contact as he confessed to murdering my son for money. The satisfaction I felt hearing his admission of guilt was cold and complete, a vindication that had been 18 months in the making and represented the culmination of everything I had sacrificed to achieve justice for Caleb. Caleb, your killer, just admitted his guilt before God and country. I thought, touching the protection necklace hidden beneath my shirt as Gerald's voice filled the courtroom with details of his crimes. Every person in this room now knows what you meant to me and what he stole from both of us when he chose money over your life. Gerald's confession continued for nearly 20 minutes, covering not only the DNR forgery and insurance fraud, but also his money laundering operation and the criminal associates who had ordered Caleb's death to protect their enterprise. He admitted to pushing my son into traffic, to lying about his whereabouts during the accident, and to planning the murder for weeks while researching the most effective methods to ensure Caleb's death would appear accidental. The detailed nature of his admission left no room for future denial or claims of temporary insanity, creating a permanent record of premeditated murder that would follow him for whatever remained of his life. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim as Gerald described the calculated nature of his crimes, and I could see her struggling to maintain judicial neutrality while listening to a grandfather confess to murdering his own grandchild. When Gerald finally finished his confession, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds, as everyone processed the enormity of what they had witnessed. Judge Morrison consulted her documents before delivering the sentence that would formalize Gerald's legal destruction and ensure he would never again pose a threat to any family member. Mr. Hale, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole with credit for time served, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed one of the most disturbing confessions of her judicial career. You will be remanded to federal custody immediately pending transfer to your designated facility. Gerald broke down crying as federal marshals approached to escort him from the courtroom, his composed facade finally cracking under the weight of his destroyed future and the public acknowledgement of his monstrous crimes. The man who had terrorized my family through financial manipulation and violence was reduced to sobbing helplessly as handcuffs were placed around his wrists. As the marshals began leading him toward the courtroom exit, Gerald turned back toward where I sat and shouted with the desperation of someone making a final appeal for mercy he didn't deserve. I confessed like you wanted. Now save Emily, you promised. Don't let an innocent child die for my crimes. His words echoed through the courtroom as the doors closed behind him, leaving me alone with the satisfaction of complete victory and the knowledge that justice for Caleb had finally been served in the most public and humiliating way possible. Gerald's desperate plea echoed in my mind as I drove back to Children's Hospital, his words creating an internal conflict that threatened to undermine everything I had worked toward for 18 months. Justice for Caleb had been served through Gerald's public confession and legal destruction, but Emily's innocent life now hung in the balance of a decision that would define whether I had become the very monster I had fought against. The moral complexity of my situation was staggering in its implications. I held absolute power over whether a 5-year-old child lived or died, and that power could be wielded as the ultimate weapon against Selena, or as an act of mercy that honored my son's memory. Letting Emily die would complete my revenge in the most devastating way possible, but it would also make me a killer of innocence, crossing a line that would transform me from an agent of justice into something indistinguishable from Gerald himself. The temptation to use Emily's life as a final punishment against Selena was almost overwhelming in its appeal. My sister had stolen my son's insurance money, worn his handmade necklace like a trophy, and dismissed his death as an inconvenience that interfered with her wedding plans. The poetic justice of watching her child die while she remained powerless to intervene would provide the same helpless agony I had experienced in that hospital waiting room 18 months earlier. But as I sat in the hospital parking garage wrestling with this impossible choice, I found myself remembering Caleb's diary entry that had guided so many of my decisions during this long campaign for justice. In his careful 7-year-old handwriting, he had written words that now seemed prophetic. I would share my toys with any kid who needed them, even if they were mean to me, because that's what Jesus would do. My son's innocent wisdom cut through the darkness that had consumed me since his death, reminding me that revenge without mercy was just another form of the evil I had been fighting. Caleb had possessed a purity of spirit that saw goodness as the default human condition, kindness as the natural response to suffering, and forgiveness as the path toward healing rather than continued destruction. The choice between becoming a killer or remaining true to my son's memory crystallized into absolute clarity as I realized that honoring Caleb meant choosing the path he would have taken. Emily was innocent of her family's crimes, just as Caleb had been innocent when Gerald murdered him for money. Allowing her to die would betray everything my son had believed about right and wrong, good and evil, justice and mercy. I entered the hospital with my decision made and immediately began the final medical preparations for bone marrow extraction. Dr. Santos had assembled a surgical team that would perform both procedures, simultaneously extracting my bone marrow while preparing Emily for the transplant that would either save her life or represent the final tragic casualty of my family's long war against each other. The pre-surgical protocols required extensive documentation of my consent and understanding of the risks involved in bone marrow donation. The procedure would involve general anesthesia while surgeons used large-bore needles to extract marrow from my pelvic bones, a process that carried risks of infection, nerve damage, and significant post-operative pain that could last for weeks. You understand that once we begin the extraction, we're committed to completing the transplant immediately, Dr. Santos confirmed as I signed the final consent forms. Emily's conditioning chemotherapy has destroyed her immune system, so any delay between extraction and transplant could be fatal, even if the marrow itself is perfect. The surgical suite where my bone marrow extraction took place was adjacent to Emily's transplant operating room, allowing the medical teams to coordinate timing with precision that left no margin for error. As anesthesia took effect, my last conscious thought was of Caleb's face, the night he had given me his protection necklace. His absolute faith that love could shield against harm. The physical pain that followed my surgery was immediate and overwhelming, radiating from my hips through my entire lower body with an intensity that made movement nearly impossible. Bone marrow extraction lived up to its reputation as one of the most painful medical procedures, but the discomfort felt insignificant compared to the knowledge that Emily was fighting for her life in the adjacent operating room with marrow that had come from my body. Recovery from the procedure required complete bed rest while my bone marrow regenerated and surgical sites healed, giving me hours to contemplate the irony of my situation. I was enduring physical agony to save the life of my enemy's child, willingly subjecting myself to pain that would benefit the family that had destroyed my son. The contradiction felt appropriate somehow, as if suffering for Emily's sake was the price required to maintain my humanity while seeking justice. Hospital staff provided regular updates about Emily's transplant procedure, which proved more complex than initially anticipated due to her weakened condition and the aggressive chemotherapy that had prepared her body to receive foreign bone marrow. The surgical team worked for nearly 6 hours to complete the transplant, with complications arising when Emily's blood pressure dropped dangerously low during the final phase of marrow infusion. Selena and Margaret maintained a vigil in the family waiting room throughout both surgeries, their prayers and desperate hope creating a stark contrast to their absence of concern when Caleb had been dying in this same hospital. I could see them through my recovery room window holding hands and crying as they waited for news about Emily's survival, displaying the kind of family unity they had never offered me during my darkest hour. Gerald's absence from this crucial family moment served as a reminder that justice had been served even as mercy was being extended. While his daughter and wife prayed for Emily's recovery, he sat in a federal holding cell awaiting transfer to the prison where he would spend the remainder of his life paying for Caleb's murder. The contrast between his isolation and their desperate hope provided its own form of poetic justice. The medical team's success in completing both procedures represented only the beginning of Emily's fight for survival, as her body would now determine whether to accept or reject the foreign bone marrow that represented her only chance for life. Dr. Santos explained that the next 72 hours would be critical in determining whether the transplant had been successful or whether Emily's immune system would attack the new marrow as an invasive threat. As I lay in my hospital bed struggling with post-surgical pain while Emily began her own battle in the pediatric intensive care unit, Dr. Santos approached, with the cautious optimism of someone who had seen too many transplants fail, despite perfect medical execution to offer false hope about the outcome. "The transplant is complete, and we've successfully infused your bone marrow into Emily's system," she said, checking my chart while speaking with the careful precision that medical professionals use when delivering news that could change everything. "But the next 72 hours will determine whether Emily's body accepts or rejects the bone marrow, and there's nothing more we can do except monitor her condition and hope her system recognizes the transplant as beneficial rather than threatening." The 72-hour critical period that would determine Emily's survival passed with agonizing slowness, each hourly medical update carrying the weight of life and death, while I recovered from my own surgical ordeal in the adjacent wing of Children's Hospital. My post-operative pain provided a constant reminder of the physical sacrifice I had made to save my enemy's child, but the discomfort felt insignificant compared to the psychological tension of waiting to learn whether my bone marrow would save or fail Emily. The first positive signs appeared on the second day, when Emily's fever broke for the first time in weeks, her small body finally showing evidence that my bone marrow was beginning to establish itself in her compromised immune system. Dr. Santos's cautious optimism grew stronger as Emily's white blood cell count began climbing from the dangerously low levels that had threatened her survival, indicating that the transplant was taking hold successfully. By the fourth day, Emily was conscious and asking for her mother with the plaintive voice of a child who couldn't understand why familiar faces had been absent during her fight for survival. I began visiting her room daily, bringing picture books and small toys while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to protect myself from becoming too attached to a child whose family had destroyed my son. "Angel Lady, will you read me the story about the bunny again?" Emily would ask during our visits, her voice growing stronger each day, as my bone marrow rebuilt her immune system from the cellular level. She had begun calling me Angel Lady after overhearing nurses discuss how I had saved her life, unaware of the complicated family history that made her survival both an act of mercy and a form of justice. Reading to Emily in her hospital bed created an unexpected echo of the bedtime stories I had shared with Caleb, but I forced myself to maintain clinical detachment during these interactions. She was an innocent child who deserved care and protection. But she was also a living reminder of the family that had murdered my son, making emotional attachment dangerous for both of us. Gerald's final sentencing occurred while Emily was still in the critical early stages of transplant recovery, providing a stark contrast between new life taking hold and old evil finally facing its consequences. The federal courthouse was once again packed with media and community members as Judge Morrison delivered the sentences that would ensure Gerald spent his remaining years paying for his crimes against both Caleb and the broader community. "Mr. Hale, you will serve 25 years in federal prison for money laundering and racketeering charges," Judge Morrison announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed Gerald's complete confession and found it appropriately damning. "Additionally, you will face state charges for insurance fraud and negligent homicide in the death of your grandson, with sentences to run consecutively rather than concurrently." Gerald's appearance in the orange jumpsuit of federal custody was pathetic compared to the confident patriarch who had dominated family dynamics for decades. His gray hair unkempt, and his face bearing the hollow expression of someone who had finally accepted the inevitability of his destruction. Judge Morrison's description of his crimes as betrayal of the most sacred trust, a grandfather's duty to protect his grandchild, would follow him into whatever prison facility became his final home. The additional state charges for Caleb's murder meant Gerald would likely die in prison, even if he served the minimum federal sentence, providing the justice that had eluded me for 18 months, while ensuring he could never again threaten any family member. His pathetic attempts to maintain dignity during sentencing only emphasized how completely his power had been broken by the consequences of his own actions. Margaret's social destruction proceeded more gradually, but was equally thorough in its elimination of her place in the community that had once respected her contributions to church and civic life. The confession she had made at St. Mark's Lutheran had created a permanent stain that no amount of repentance or charitable work could remove, transforming her from beloved community elder into someone whose presence reminded everyone of unspeakable betrayal. Former friends crossed streets to avoid encountering her during shopping trips, their obvious discomfort making clear that forgiveness was impossible for someone who had chosen money over her grandson's life. Church groups expelled her membership with unanimous votes that reflected the congregation's collective revulsion at her crimes. Volunteer organizations revoked her positions without discussion, as if her very presence would contaminate their charitable work. The isolation that followed was absolute and crushing in ways that made Margaret's daily existence a form of living death. Her phone, once busy with social coordination and friendly check-ins, sat silent for days at a time. Invitations stopped arriving for events that had once defined her calendar. Neighbors who had chatted over backyard fences for decades suddenly found urgent indoor tasks whenever she appeared in her garden. Margaret's daily routine became a monument to loneliness, sitting by her front window watching neighborhood children play while remembering Caleb's visits and the choice she had made to prioritize money over his survival. The guilt that consumed her was visible in her deteriorating appearance and increasingly erratic behavior, creating a feedback loop of shame and isolation that made normal social interaction impossible. The community's collective shunning created conditions that made Margaret's natural death from the accumulated stress of shame and isolation almost inevitable. Her body, weakened by months of poor sleep and irregular eating caused by psychological trauma, simply couldn't sustain the weight of living with her crimes while facing complete social rejection. Emily's recovery accelerated during her second week post-transplant, with her energy levels improving dramatically as my bone marrow established itself and began producing the healthy blood cells that would sustain her for the rest of her life. She began taking short walks in the hospital corridors, her small hand holding mine as she proudly showed off her increasing strength to nurses and doctors who had watched her fight for survival. "Look, Angel Lady! I can walk all the way to the window without getting tired," Emily announced during one of our afternoon visits, her voice carrying the excitement of a child rediscovering her physical capabilities after weeks of life-threatening illness. The transformation from the pale, weak child I had first encountered to this energetic little girl was remarkable evidence of the transplant's success. Her progress was so encouraging that Dr. Santos began discussing discharge planning and long-term follow-up care conversations that raised questions about Emily's living situation and legal guardianship that had been temporarily suspended during the medical crisis. The reality of Emily's future care needs would require decisions about custody and family structure that had been postponed while everyone focused on keeping her alive. As Emily took her first confident steps down the hospital corridor without assistance, demonstrating the successful integration of my bone marrow into her young body, Selena approached me with a manila envelope containing legal documents that would change everything about Emily's future. "Vivian, I need to talk to you about Emily's custody," Selena said, her voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who had accepted the complete destruction of her previous life. "I'm signing over full legal custody to you. I don't deserve to be her mother after what I've done." The legal proceedings for Selena's voluntary termination of parental rights took place in a sterile family court conference room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and accumulated desperation from countless custody battles. Selena sat across from me at a polished wooden table, her appearance dramatically altered from the confident woman who had once dismissed my son's death as an inconvenience that interfered with her wedding plans. The documents spread before us represented the complete dissolution of her maternal relationship with Emily. Legal paperwork that would sever the biological bond between mother and daughter while transferring all parental authority to someone who had once been considered dead weight by this same family. Judge Sarah Matthews, who specialized in complex custody cases, reviewed the termination papers with the careful attention of someone who understood the permanent nature of what Selena was proposing. Mrs. Patterson, you understand that by signing these documents, you are permanently relinquishing all parental rights to your daughter Emily. Judge Matthews explained, her voice carrying the weight of legal finality. This decision cannot be reversed regardless of changes in your circumstances or regret about your choice. Emily will legally become Mrs. Chen's daughter in every respect. Selena's emotional breakdown began before she even touched the pen. Tears streaming down her face as she confronted the reality of losing her daughter forever as a direct consequence of the choices she had made years earlier. Her voice was barely audible as she acknowledged her unfitness as a mother, admitting that her role in Caleb's death and subsequent family destruction had made her incapable of providing the stable, loving environment Emily deserved. I endangered my daughter's life through my selfishness and greed. Selena whispered, her signature shaking as she signed away her maternal rights with trembling hands. I chose money over family, and now I have to live with the consequences of destroying everything I should have protected. The signing process took nearly an hour as legal representatives ensured that Selena understood the permanence of her decision and wasn't being coerced into surrendering custody. Her complete surrender represented the final stage of her destruction, the acknowledgement that she had become so morally compromised that even she recognized her inability to raise the child she had birthed. Watching Selena voluntarily exile herself from Emily's life provided a satisfaction that was both complete and hollow justice served through consequences that she had imposed upon herself, rather than punishments I had been forced to inflict. Her recognition of her own unworthiness as a mother represented the ultimate victory over someone who had viewed my son as expendable. Within a week of signing the custody papers, Selena left Iowa with nothing but a single suitcase containing clothes and personal items that represented the entirety of her remaining possessions. Her financial destruction was so complete that she couldn't afford moving expenses or security deposits for apartments, forcing her to rely on Greyhound buses and homeless shelters as she attempted to disappear from the wreckage of her previous life. Her destination was Minneapolis, a city large enough to provide anonymity while offering minimum wage employment opportunities that might allow her to survive without references or professional credentials. The teaching career that had once provided financial stability and social respect was permanently closed to her, making food service and retail work her only options for supporting herself. The letters Selena wrote to Emily arrived daily at my address, pathetic attempts to maintain connection with the daughter she had legally abandoned. I read each letter carefully before filing them away undelivered, studying her evolving emotional state and growing desperation as months passed without any response from the child she had given up. Her handwriting revealed increasing stress and deteriorating health, while her words conveyed the kind of regret that comes from understanding consequences too late to change them. My beautiful Emily, Mommy thinks about you every day and hopes the angel lady is taking good care of you. One letter read the paper stained with tears that had smeared her careful handwriting. I made terrible choices that hurt our family, and now I'm living with the punishment I deserve. Please know that giving you to someone who could love you properly was the only good decision Mommy ever made. Selena's life in Minneapolis became a testament to the permanent consequences of betraying family loyalty and murdering innocent children for financial gain. She worked double shifts at fast food restaurants and cleaning services, earning barely enough to afford shared rooms in boarding houses that catered to society's most desperate residents. Her aging accelerated dramatically under the stress of poverty and isolation, gray hair appearing and deep lines forming as her body reflected the psychological toll of living with unbearable guilt. The health problems that developed from malnutrition, inadequate medical care, and constant stress created a downward spiral that made normal social interaction increasingly difficult. Selena's attempts to form friendships or romantic relationships inevitably collapsed when her past became known, leaving her more isolated with each failed connection to other human beings. Her dedication to atoning for her betrayal of Caleb took the form of volunteer work at children's hospitals and homeless shelters, unpaid labor that consumed her free time while providing some psychological relief from the constant weight of guilt. She never remarried or attempted to have other children, apparently believing that she had forfeited the right to maternal happiness through her participation in my son's murder. The Christmas cards and birthday cards she sent for Emily went undelivered each year, accumulating in a file that documented her persistent hope for forgiveness that would never come. Her letters revealed a woman slowly deteriorating under the weight of consequences she had brought upon herself each year, bringing new evidence of declining physical and mental health. The private investigator I had monitoring Selena's activities reported her increasing isolation and deteriorating living conditions with clinical detachment, noting her progression from shared apartments to rooming houses to periods of actual homelessness when even minimum wage employment couldn't cover basic expenses. Her life had become a cautionary tale about the long-term costs of choosing money over moral principles. Emily's adaptation to her new life proceeded smoothly, with her memories of Selena gradually fading as she formed stronger attachments to the stability and care I provided. She called me Mama Vivian, with increasing naturalness, while her biological mother became a distant figure from a traumatic period that felt increasingly unreal as years passed. The child psychology team that monitored Emily's emotional development reported excellent progress in her ability to form healthy attachments and process the trauma of her early medical crisis. She rarely asked about her biological mother after the first year, apparently accepting the explanation that Mommy Selena had to go away to learn how to be a better person. 5 years after gaining custody of Emily, I received a phone call that would test whether my capacity for mercy had been exhausted by years of successful revenge against the family that had destroyed my son. The voice belonged to a social worker in Minneapolis, who had been given my contact information by someone claiming to be Emily's biological mother. "Mrs. Chen, I'm calling about Selena Patterson, who says you have custody of her daughter Emily." The social worker said, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering difficult news. "Ms. Patterson is in hospice care with terminal pancreatic cancer, and she's requesting one final visit with her daughter before she dies." The news about Selena's terminal cancer arrived during a period when I had been carefully constructing a new life around Emily, and the growing sense that my 18-month campaign for justice had achieved its primary objectives. Gerald's crimes had been exposed, his freedom permanently revoked, and his reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. But the phone call from Minneapolis reminded me that loose ends from my revenge campaign were still unraveling in ways that would provide final confirmation of justice served. Gerald's death in federal prison occurred 3 years into his 25-year sentence. News that reached me through a brief notification from the Bureau of Prisons that was as clinical and emotionless as his crimes had been calculating and cruel. The official cause of death was listed as injuries sustained during altercation with other inmates. But the prison chaplain's follow-up call provided details that satisfied my need to understand how justice had ultimately been served. "Your father was killed by inmates who learned about his conviction for murdering a child," the chaplain explained with the weary tone of someone who had delivered similar news to countless families. Word spreads quickly in federal facilities about crimes involving children, and prisoners have their own system of justice for those they consider beneath contempt. The irony of Gerald dying at the hands of criminals who considered child murder unforgivable wasn't lost on me as I processed the news with complete emotional detachment. The man who had viewed my son as a financial asset had been eliminated by people who, despite their own crimes, drew moral lines that he had crossed. His death represented natural consequences, rather than orchestrated revenge justice served through prison dynamics that operated independently of my influence. Gerald's burial took place in an unmarked section of the county cemetery reserved for indigents, and unclaimed bodies with no family members attending the brief graveside service, conducted by a prison chaplain who had never known him personally. I learned about the funeral location through public records but chose not to attend, feeling that my presence would dignify his death in ways he didn't deserve. His unmarked grave would ensure that future generations would have no monument to visit or legacy to remember. Margaret's death from isolation and shame occurred 18 months after Gerald's prison demise, discovered only when neighbors noticed mail accumulating in her box and newspapers piling on her front porch. The isolation that had consumed her life since her church confession had created living conditions that made her death seem inevitable rather than surprising the natural consequence of a woman who had chosen money over family and paid the ultimate price in loneliness. The police report described finding Margaret alone in her house, apparently having died in her sleep, while sitting in the chair by her front window, where she had spent months watching neighborhood children play while remembering the grandson she had helped murder. Her body had been undiscovered for nearly a week, with only the postal workers' concern about accumulated mail alerting authorities to investigate. Margaret's funeral was held at a small chapel outside of town, with me as the only attendee willing to ensure she received proper burial despite her crimes. The service was conducted by a minister who had never met her reading generic prayers over a casket that would be lowered into a grave marked only with her name and dates of birth and death. As the cemetery workers began filling the grave, I placed a single white flower on the casket and whispered words that felt like closing a chapter. "You chose money over blood. Now you have neither." The destruction of my family's legacy in the community was systematic and complete, as if 20 years of their presence were being methodically erased from local memory. Gerald's antique business was demolished after federal authorities finished processing it as a crime scene. The building razed and the lot converted to a small park where children now played on equipment that bore no mention of its previous use. The house where I had grown up was sold to strangers from out of state who painted over its familiar colors and replanted the garden to eliminate any trace of Margaret's careful landscaping. Family photographs were removed from community displays at the library church and historical society, their absence creating gaps in visual records that made it seem as if the Hale family had never existed in Maplewood. The memorial plaques Gerald had purchased to honor his parents were quietly relocated to storage areas where they wouldn't remind community members of his crimes. Even the pew where our family had sat for Sunday services was marked with a small plaque honoring a different family's contributions to the church. Caleb's memory, by contrast, was honored through the scholarship fund I had established in his name at the elementary school, where he would have continued his education. His photograph hung in the school hallway alongside other children who had made positive impacts on the community, with a plaque describing his dreams of becoming a doctor and helping others. The contrast between his honored memory and his killer's erasure from community consciousness provided its own form of poetic justice. The systematic destruction of my family's place in local history felt appropriate and complete, as if karma itself had conspired to ensure that those who had chosen evil would be forgotten, while their innocent victim would be remembered for his potential and goodness. The community's collective decision to eliminate traces of Gerald, Margaret, and Selena from public memory while preserving Caleb's legacy demonstrated how completely justice had been served through natural consequences rather than forced revenge. Standing in the small family section of Maplewood Cemetery where Gerald and Margaret lay in their unmarked graves, I felt the strange emptiness that comes from achieving a goal that has consumed years of planning and effort. My campaign for justice had succeeded beyond my most optimistic expectations, with each family member paying the ultimate price for their role in Caleb's murder, while my son's memory remained untainted by their crimes. The satisfaction I felt was real but incomplete, accompanied by the growing recognition that revenge, no matter how successfully executed, couldn't restore what had been lost or fill the void left by Caleb's absence. Justice had been served, but the achievement felt hollow compared to the love and joy that had been stolen from my life when Gerald pushed my son into traffic for insurance money. Emily's presence in my life had provided purpose during the final stages of my revenge campaign, but as I stood among the graves of Caleb's killers, I realized that my future required more than just caring for one child or managing the consequences of past actions. The woman who had systematically destroyed her family's lives needed to find new meaning in constructive rather than destructive pursuits. Looking at the unmarked earth where my parents and their crimes lay buried, I whispered to the Iowa wind that carried my words toward wherever Caleb's spirit might be listening. Your killers are gone, their legacy erased, and justice has been completely served. Now, what do I do with the rest of my life? The answer to my whispered question about life's purpose began revealing itself in the most unexpected way through the gradual transformation of my relationship with Emily, from strategic necessity into genuine maternal love. What had started as an obligation to honor my promise and demonstrate mercy had evolved into something that surprised me with its depth and authenticity, filling spaces in my heart that I had assumed were permanently sealed by grief and rage. Emily, at 10 years old, bore little resemblance to the pale, dying child I had saved through bone marrow donation 5 years earlier. She had grown into a vibrant, curious girl whose energy and intelligence reminded me daily of why protecting children mattered more than punishing adults. Her transformation from victim to thriving child provided evidence that healing was possible even after the most devastating trauma, a lesson I was slowly learning to apply to my own damaged life. "Mama Viv, look what I painted in art class today," Emily would announce each afternoon, rushing through our front door with the enthusiasm of someone who had never learned to fear that happiness could be stolen without warning. Her artistic talents were emerging with the same creative intensity that had characterized Caleb's scientific curiosity, though her medium was watercolors and charcoal rather than observation and documentation. The joy Emily brought into my daily existence was unexpected and transformative, gradually displacing the cold satisfaction that had sustained me during years of systematic revenge. Her laughter during our evening reading sessions, her excited chatter about school friends and classroom projects, her unconscious trust that I would always be there to protect and support her. These simple pleasures had somehow become more meaningful than all the elaborate justice I had orchestrated against her biological family. My restaurant business had flourished during the years when my primary focus was destroying Gerald's criminal enterprise success that seemed almost accidental given how little attention I had paid to profit margins while pursuing justice. The management skills I had developed through necessity, strategic thinking, personnel evaluation, financial analysis, long-term planning, proved surprisingly applicable to legitimate business expansion. The original restaurant in Cedar Rapids had generated enough profit to fund a second location in Iowa City, which led to a third establishment in Ames near the university campus. Each new restaurant employed primarily single mothers and women facing economic hardship, creating a supportive work environment that provided flexibility for childcare needs and advancement opportunities for employees who demonstrated reliability and initiative. "You've created something special here," my regional manager Lisa Chen commented during one of our quarterly reviews, studying profit reports that showed consistent growth across all locations. "The employee retention rate is unprecedented for the restaurant industry, and customer loyalty keeps increasing every quarter." The business success felt surreal given its origins in grief and rage, but it provided financial security that allowed me to focus on Emily's needs and my growing involvement in community advocacy work. The leadership skills forged during my campaign against Gerald, patience, strategic thinking, the ability to coordinate complex operations while maintaining long-term vision, translated effectively into managing multiple restaurant locations and their diverse staffing challenges. My transformation from hidden predator to respected community leader occurred gradually as Emily's medical history and my role in saving her life became known throughout Des Moines. Hospital administrators invited me to serve on advisory boards for pediatric care policies, recognizing my unique perspective as someone who had navigated both the medical and legal complexities of childhood illness within dysfunctional family structures. The insurance reform legislation I supported drew from painful personal experience with beneficiary fraud and the vulnerabilities that allowed predators like Gerald to exploit family trust for financial gain. My testimony before state legislative committees carried the authority of someone who had lived through the consequences of inadequate legal protections for children's financial interests. Mrs. Chen's advocacy has been instrumental in strengthening legal safeguards that protect minors from financial exploitation by family members. Congressman David Martinez announced during the bill signing ceremony for the Children's Financial Protection Act. Her personal experience and professional expertise have created legislation that will prevent future tragedies. The scholarship programs I established in Caleb's name provided educational opportunities for children who had lost parents, creating positive legacy from tragedy that honored my son's memory while helping other families avoid the financial hardships that could make them vulnerable to predators. The annual scholarship ceremony became an opportunity to celebrate academic achievement while acknowledging the resilience children could demonstrate when provided with appropriate support. Emily's presence at these community events brought additional meaning to my advocacy work, as she represented living proof that children could recover from trauma and thrive when given stability and unconditional love. Her easy interaction with other scholarship recipients and her genuine interest in their educational goals demonstrated the empathy and social awareness that would serve her well throughout life. The pain that had driven my quest for revenge had indeed transformed into purpose, but the transformation was more complete and healing than I had ever anticipated when standing among my family's graves questioning what to do with the remainder of my life. Emily's love had taught me that creating rather than destroying, building rather than tearing down, protecting rather than punishing, could provide satisfaction that revenge had never delivered. My daily routine now revolved around school schedules and parent-teacher conferences rather than surveillance schedules and evidence collection. Emily's homework help replaced my evening hours spent planning family destruction. Her friends' birthday parties and school plays filled weekends that had once been devoted to coordinating with investigators and attorneys. The woman I had become bore little resemblance to either the naive librarian who had trusted her family's good intentions, or the calculating predator who had systematically destroyed their lives. Emily had shown me how to channel protective instincts into nurturing rather than vengeance, how to use strategic thinking for building futures rather than dismantling them. Our home office, which had once served as command center for my revenge campaign, was now Emily's art studio, where she created paintings and drawings that covered our refrigerator and filled scrapbooks documenting her creative development. The wall charts tracking Gerald's criminal activities had been replaced by Emily's school calendar and art class schedule's transformation that symbolized how completely my priorities had shifted from past justice to future possibility. I was organizing Emily's art supplies one evening when she began exploring the desk drawers where I kept important documents and family records. Her natural curiosity led her to discover items I had assumed were safely hidden from her innocent perspective, including the small spiral notebook that had started my journey toward justice 5 years earlier. Mama Viv, who was this boy who wrote about protecting his mommy? Emily asked innocently, holding Caleb's diary with the same careful attention she gave to her own creative projects, unaware that she was holding evidence of the love that had ultimately saved her life. I looked at Emily holding Caleb's diary, her 10-year-old face filled with the innocent curiosity that had led her to discover the most important secret in our home. The moment I had been dreading and preparing for had arrived unexpectedly, forcing me to navigate the delicate balance between protecting her childhood and honoring the truth that had brought us together. "That diary belonged to your cousin Caleb," I said gently, sitting beside her on the office floor and taking the small notebook with the reverence it deserved. "He was my son who died before you were old enough to remember him, but his love for his family is the reason you're alive today." Emily's eyes widened with the serious attention she reserved for important conversations, her artistic sensitivity allowing her to recognize that this moment carried weight beyond typical bedtime stories or homework discussions. She waited patiently as I chose words that would convey the significance of Caleb's life and death, without burdening her with details too dark for a child to process. Caleb wrote in this diary about wanting to protect people he loved, especially his mommy. I continued opening to pages where his careful handwriting documented his dreams of becoming a doctor and healing the world. "When you were very sick and needed special medicine that only I could give you, I remembered what Caleb had written about helping people, and I knew he would want me to save you." The explanation I provided focused on themes of family protecting family, love transcending loss, and the way Caleb's generous spirit had inspired my decision to donate bone marrow despite the complicated history between our families. I described how his diary had reminded me that children deserved protection from adult mistakes, and how saving Emily's life had honored his memory by choosing mercy over revenge. Your biological parents made some very bad choices that hurt our family. I said, carefully avoiding graphic details while ensuring Emily understood why we lived quietly away from extended relatives. They chose money over love, and their decisions put you in danger. That's why the court decided you would be safer living with me, and why I became your legal mother. Emily processed this information with the remarkable maturity that serious illness and family trauma had forced upon her, asking thoughtful questions about Caleb's personality, his dreams for the future, and whether he would have liked her if they had been able to meet. Her ability to grasp complex emotional concepts without becoming overwhelmed demonstrated the resilience that had carried her through medical crises and family dissolution. "So Caleb was like my guardian angel who sent you to save me?" Emily asked, her artistic imagination transforming the story into something beautiful rather than tragic. "And now you take care of me because that's what he would have wanted you to do." Her interpretation of events touched something deep in my heart, confirming that sharing the truth had been the right decision despite my fears about burdening her with family history. Emily's gratitude for being saved and protected was genuine and profound, expressed through spontaneous hugs and whispered thank yous that carried the weight of someone who understood how close she had come to losing everything. The weeks following our conversation brought subtle but significant changes to Emily's behavior and our relationship. She began asking to visit Caleb's grave on weekends, bringing flowers she had picked from our garden, and small drawings she had made depicting him as an angel watching over children. Her rituals at his graveside were touching in their simplicity, usually involving sitting quietly by the headstone while telling him about her school projects and artistic achievements. "Thank you for sending Mama Viv to save me, Cousin Caleb," she would whisper during these visits, her voice carrying the sincerity of someone who truly believed in the protective power of love that transcended death. "I promise to be good and make both of you proud of me." Emily's understanding of why I sometimes looked sad during quiet moments, why we had no contact with extended family, and why our household operated differently from her classmates' families, demonstrated emotional intelligence that exceeded her chronological age. She stopped asking about biological grandparents, or why we never attended large family gatherings, accepting our circumstances with the wisdom of someone who had learned early that not all families were safe or loving. Our bond deepened through shared acknowledgement of the truth that connected us, creating intimacy based on honesty rather than protective deception. Emily knew she was loved and chosen, understood that her presence in my life was meaningful and treasured, and recognized that our family had been forged through tragedy, but strengthened through mutual care and protection. "I want to be just like you when I grow up, Mama Viv," Emily announced during one of our evening art sessions, her voice carrying the determination of someone who had found her role model and life purpose. Strong enough to protect people who need help, and brave enough to do the right thing even when it's scary. Her declaration filled me with pride and hope, suggesting that the lessons Caleb had taught me about choosing mercy over revenge, protection over destruction, and love over hatred were being passed to the next generation through Emily's developing moral compass. She was learning that strength meant using power to help rather than harm, that courage meant standing up for vulnerable people, and that family meant choosing to love and protect rather than exploit and abandon. The conversations about Caleb had also helped Emily understand her own survival story in ways that made her feel special rather than victimized, chosen rather than abandoned, and loved rather than unwanted. She began incorporating themes of protection and healing into her artwork, creating paintings that depicted children being shielded by guardian figures and communities where everyone looked after each other. Her creative development reflected the security and love that had replaced the trauma and medical crisis that had dominated her early childhood, proving that children could recover completely from devastating experiences when provided with stability, honesty, and unconditional care. The transformation from dying child to thriving pre-adolescent represented hope for all families dealing with serious illness and dysfunction. As Emily worked on a particularly elaborate drawing that showed children and adults building something together, she looked up from her art supplies with the expression she wore when important ideas were forming in her creative mind. Her question would challenge both of us to think beyond our comfortable present toward a future that could benefit other families facing similar struggles. Mama Viv, I've been thinking about Caleb and all the kids who need help, like I needed help, she said, setting down her colored pencils to give this conversation her full attention. Can we start a place where kids like me and Caleb can be safe from bad grown-ups? Emily's question about creating a safe place for vulnerable children sparked an idea that had been forming in my subconscious since the day I had chosen to save her life, rather than complete my revenge through her death. Her innocent suggestion crystallized into a vision that would transform our personal healing into a systematic effort to protect other children from the kind of predatory family exploitation that had cost Caleb his life. The planning process for what would become Caleb's Shield Foundation began that very evening with Emily and me sitting at our kitchen table sketching ideas for an organization that could provide the protection and advocacy that had been missing when my son needed it most. Emily, now 12, and increasingly sophisticated in her understanding of injustice and protection, contributed insights from her own experience of surviving family betrayal and medical crisis. We need lawyers who understand that sometimes families are the danger, not the solution, Emily observed with the wisdom of someone who had lived through adult betrayal. And we need safe places where kids can stay while the grown-ups figure out how to keep them protected from their own relatives. Her contributions to our planning sessions were remarkably mature and practical, drawing from her memories of feeling helpless while adults made decisions about her life without considering her welfare. She understood intuitively that children needed advocates who would prioritize their safety over family preservation, financial convenience, or social appearances. The Foundation's mission evolved into providing legal advocacy, financial support, and emergency housing for children whose family members exploited or endangered them through insurance fraud, financial abuse, medical neglect, or other forms of predatory behavior. Our target population included minors whose relatives had changed insurance beneficiaries without consent, children being used as collateral for adult debts, and kids whose medical care was being compromised by family financial schemes. David Kim, who had been instrumental in my legal battles against Gerald, became our founding legal director, bringing expertise in white-collar crime and family law that would prove essential for navigating the complex intersection of criminal prosecution and child protection. His network of contacts in federal law enforcement provided crucial resources for investigating financial crimes targeting minors. "You're creating something that should have existed long before Caleb needed it," David said during one of our organizational meetings. "The legal system has enormous gaps when it comes to protecting children from financially motivated crimes by family members." Our first case arrived through a referral from Children's Hospital, where a 9-year-old cancer patient named Marcus Williams was being denied potentially life-saving treatment because his stepfather had redirected his insurance benefits to cover gambling debts. The parallels to my own experience were immediate and disturbing, but this time I had resources and expertise to intervene before tragedy occurred. Emily accompanied me to our first meeting with Marcus, her presence providing peer support that adult advocates couldn't offer. She understood the fear and confusion of being sick while adults argued about money, and her ability to communicate with him about surviving family betrayal proved invaluable for building trust and cooperation. "The scary grown-ups don't get to win when there are people like Mama Viv who fight for kids," Emily told Marcus during one of our hospital visits, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had experienced rescue and protection. "You're going to be okay because we know how to stop them." The Foundation's intervention in Marcus's case involved coordinating with federal investigators to expose his stepfather's insurance fraud while simultaneously working with Child Protective Services to ensure his medical care continued uninterrupted. Our success in securing his treatment and removing him from his stepfather's financial control provided a template for future cases involving medical neglect and insurance exploitation. Within 18 months, Caleb's Shield Foundation had successfully intervened in 12 cases across Iowa and neighboring states, each victory representing a child who had been protected from the kind of family predation that had killed my son. Our investigative capabilities, legal resources, and emergency housing network created a comprehensive support system that addressed both immediate safety needs and long-term protection from family financial abuse. The Foundation's growing reputation for successful intervention in complex family financial crimes attracted national attention from child advocacy organizations and federal law enforcement agencies. My testimony before congressional subcommittees on insurance fraud and child protection drew from painful personal experience while advocating for legislative reforms that would prevent future tragedies. Caleb Chen died because existing laws failed to protect him from a grandfather who viewed him as a financial asset rather than a beloved grandchild. I told the House Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, "Every child deserves legal safeguards that prevent family members from profiting from their death or suffering." Emily's participation in congressional hearings and advocacy events provided powerful testimony about surviving family betrayal while demonstrating that children could recover completely from such trauma when provided with appropriate support and protection. Her ability to articulate the child's perspective on financial exploitation made our advocacy efforts more compelling and effective. The Children's Financial Protection Act, which incorporated many of our recommended reforms, established federal oversight of insurance beneficiary changes involving minors and created legal penalties for family members who exploited children's financial assets. Emily's presence at the bill signing ceremony represented hope for future generations of children who would be protected by legislation written in Caleb's memory. Our work with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division helped identify patterns of family financial abuse that extended far beyond individual cases, revealing networks of predatory behavior that had operated undetected for years. The database we developed, tracking insurance fraud, targeting minors, became a national resource for law enforcement agencies investigating similar crimes. Emily's role in the Foundation evolved from contributor to junior advocate as she developed public speaking skills and deepened her understanding of child protection issues. Her presentations at conferences and training sessions for social workers carried the authenticity of lived experience while demonstrating the Foundation's success in helping children heal from family trauma. My cousin Caleb couldn't be saved because no one knew how to recognize the danger he was in. Emily would tell audiences of child protection professionals, but now we know what to look for and we have tools to protect kids before it's too late. The Foundation's success in building a national network of attorneys, investigators, and safe housing providers created the infrastructure necessary to respond quickly to emerging threats against vulnerable children. Our emergency response team could mobilize within hours to provide legal intervention, protective custody, and medical advocacy for children facing immediate danger from family exploitation. The satisfaction I derived from protecting other children felt different from the cold justice I had achieved through destroying Gerald's criminal enterprise warmer and more sustainable in ways that honored Caleb's memory through creation rather than destruction. Each child we saved represented a victory for the innocent over those who would exploit them, justice served through prevention rather than punishment. 3 years after establishing the Foundation, our success rate in protecting children from family financial abuse had exceeded our most optimistic projections, with 0 deaths among the children under our protection and numerous successful prosecutions of predatory family members. The network we had built was saving lives that might otherwise have been lost to greed and exploitation. That success was about to be tested when my phone rang on a Tuesday evening with news that would challenge everything Emily and I had built. The caller was Detective Sarah Morrison from the Nebraska State Police, her voice carrying the urgency that came from recognizing a pattern that demanded immediate intervention. "Mrs. Chen, I'm calling about a situation developing in Omaha involving a 6-year-old boy named Timothy Hansen," she said without preamble. "His grandfather just changed the child's insurance beneficiary under suspicious circumstances, and the family dynamics are displaying all the warning signs your Foundation's training materials describe." Detective Morrison's call about Timothy Hansen triggered immediate recognition of the warning patterns that had preceded Caleb's murder, sending me into the focused operational mode that had become second nature during my years of protecting vulnerable children. The details she provided over the phone were disturbingly familiar. A 6-year-old boy whose grandfather had recently changed insurance beneficiaries during a period of family financial stress, combined with concerning behavioral changes that suggested the child was being viewed as an asset rather than a person. Emily and I were on a plane to Omaha within 6 hours of receiving the call, our emergency response protocols allowing us to mobilize the Foundation's resources with the speed that often meant the difference between intervention and tragedy. During the flight, I reviewed case files that Detective Morrison had transmitted electronically, studying photographs of Timothy Hansen that showed a bright-eyed boy whose innocent smile reminded me painfully of Caleb at the same age. The insurance change happened 3 weeks ago, just after the grandfather's gambling debts exceeded $200,000. I explained to Emily as we studied the documentation together. The family's financial stress, the timing of the policy modification, and the grandfather's increasingly erratic behavior toward Timothy all match the pattern we've identified in 17 previous cases. Emily, now 14 and seasoned in recognizing the behavioral indicators of family financial predation, reviewed Timothy's school records and teacher observations with the analytical skills that had developed through her work with traumatized children. Her ability to identify subtle signs of emotional distress in child victims had become invaluable for early intervention efforts. His teachers report that Timothy has started asking weird questions about whether kids can die from accidents, and he's been drawing pictures of children being chased by monster figures. Emily noted, pointing to psychological assessments that painted a disturbing picture. He's already sensing that something bad is going to happen to him. Our arrival in Omaha coincided with a coordinated intervention that demonstrated how far the Foundation's capabilities had advanced since our early cases. FBI agents specializing in financial crimes against minors were already conducting surveillance of the grandfather's activities, while Child Protective Services had prepared emergency custody procedures that could be implemented within hours of judicial approval. The investigation revealed that Timothy's grandfather, Robert Hansen, was following the same methodical approach to murder that Gerald had used against Caleb. Hansen had researched Timothy's daily routines, identified vulnerable locations along his walk to school, and even practiced timing that would make any eventual accident appear coincidental rather than orchestrated. We found handwritten notes in Hansen's car detailing Timothy's schedule and route to school. FBI agent Patricia Williams informed me during our briefing at the Omaha field office. He's been planning this for weeks, waiting for the optimal moment to push the child into traffic, just like your case file predicted he would. The difference between Timothy's situation and Caleb's tragedy was the existence of our Foundation's early warning system and rapid response capabilities. Where Caleb had been isolated and unprotected, Timothy was surrounded by advocates who recognized the danger and possessed the resources to intervene before harm occurred. The legal intervention proceeded with surgical precision, combining federal charges for insurance fraud with state charges for conspiracy to commit murder based on the evidence we had helped gather. Hansen's arrest occurred at his residence while Timothy was safely at school, preventing any possibility that desperation might accelerate his timeline for harming his grandson. Emily's role in Timothy's recovery began immediately after his placement in emergency protective custody, where her experience surviving family betrayal made her uniquely qualified to help him process the reality that his own grandfather had been planning to kill him for money. Her natural empathy and hard-earned wisdom provided comfort that adult professionals couldn't offer. "The scary feelings you're having aren't your fault," Emily told Timothy during their first meeting at the Children's Advocacy Center, where he was receiving crisis counseling. "When grown-ups make bad choices about money, it doesn't mean the kids did anything wrong. You're safe now because people who care about protecting children found out what was happening." Timothy's response to Emily's peer counseling was immediate and profound, his emotional walls crumbling as he recognized someone who truly understood the confusion and fear of discovering that family members could be dangerous. Their conversations, supervised by child psychologists, became essential components of his healing process. The foster family we helped select for Timothy's placement represented the best possible outcome for a child who had lost his biological family to greed and criminal behavior. Mark and Jennifer Torres experienced foster parents who specialized in caring for children traumatized by family violence, provided the stability and security that would allow Timothy to recover from his ordeal. "He's starting to smile again," Jennifer reported during our weekly check-in calls. "The nightmares are decreasing, and he's begun talking about wanting to be a police officer when he grows up so he can protect other kids from bad grown-ups." Timothy's successful rescue and Hanson's prosecution represented the Foundation's most complex intervention to date, demonstrating that our systems for identifying and preventing family financial predation had matured into a comprehensive child protection network. The case also provided validation that Caleb's death had ultimately created something meaningful and life-saving. Emily's growth as an advocate was evident in her increasingly sophisticated understanding of trauma recovery and her natural ability to connect with children facing circumstances similar to her own early experiences. Her presentations to child protection professionals about recognizing signs of family financial abuse drew standing ovations and requests for additional training sessions. Caleb's death taught us what to look for, and Timothy's rescue proves that we can prevent these tragedies when we act quickly enough, Emily said during her keynote address to the National Conference on Child Financial Abuse. "Every child we save honors my cousin's memory and proves that love is stronger than greed." The celebration dinner we held after Timothy's successful placement felt different from previous Foundation victories, carrying additional significance, because it represented our most complete prevention of the cycle that had destroyed my family. Timothy would live, thrive, and eventually contribute to society in ways that honored both his survival and Caleb's sacrifice. Our sense of triumph and closure was interrupted by a phone call that would challenge everything Emily and I had built together over the previous 5 years. The caller was Dr. Patricia Chen from Minneapolis General Hospital, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that medical professionals use when delivering news that could change everything. "Mrs. Chen, I'm calling about Selena Patterson, who claims to be your sister," Dr. Chen said, consulting what sounded like medical records. "She's been admitted to our hospice unit with terminal pancreatic cancer, and she's been asking repeatedly to speak with you about making amends before she dies." The drive to Minneapolis felt like traveling backward through time, each mile carrying Emily and me toward a confrontation with the past that I had assumed was permanently closed. 5 years had passed since Selena had signed away her parental rights and disappeared into the anonymity of urban poverty. But the phone call from Dr. Chen had reopened wounds that I thought had healed completely through our work with the Foundation. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat during our 3-hour journey, processing the news that her biological mother was dying and wanted to see her one final time. At 14, she possessed the emotional maturity to understand the complexity of our situation, but I could see the uncertainty in her expression as she wrestled with feelings towards someone who had been absent from her life during its most formative years. "I don't remember much about her," Emily said as we entered Minneapolis city limits, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone she used when working through difficult emotions. "Sometimes I wonders what she looks like now or whether she thinks about me, but mostly she feels like someone from a story rather than my real mother." The hospice unit at Minneapolis General Hospital was designed to provide comfort and dignity during life's final transitions, but nothing could soften the shock of seeing what cancer had done to Selena over the past 5 years. The woman lying in the narrow hospital bed bore little resemblance to the confident teacher who had once stolen my son's insurance money for her wedding reception. Cancer had reduced Selena to a skeletal shadow, her hair gone from chemotherapy treatments that had ultimately failed to stop the disease's progression. Her face, hollow and aged beyond her years, showed the accumulated toll of poverty, isolation, and the guilt that had consumed her since Emily's custody transfer. When she opened her eyes and saw us standing in her doorway, tears began flowing immediately. "Emily, my beautiful girl," Selena whispered, her voice barely audible through the oxygen mask that helped her breathe. "You've grown so tall and lovely. I can see intelligence in your eyes that reminds me of your father." Emily approached the bed cautiously, her natural compassion overcoming any residual anger or confusion about their relationship. She took Selena's frail hand with the gentleness she had learned through years of volunteering with traumatized children, offering comfort without judgment or expectation. "I'm sorry for everything I did to hurt our family." Selena continued, her words directed toward both Emily and me. "I chose money over love, and I destroyed the most precious things in my life because I was selfish and greedy. I can never undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that giving you to Vivian was the only good decision I ever made." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I had anticipated during our drive to Minneapolis. Selena's remorse was genuine and complete, free from the self-pity or blame-shifting that had characterized her behavior during the family's destruction. Cancer and poverty had stripped away her pretenses, leaving someone who could finally acknowledge the full scope of her crimes without making excuses. "You've become everything I hoped you could be," Selena told Emily, studying her daughter's face with the desperate intensity of someone trying to memorize details before permanent separation. "Vivian gave you the love and stability I never could have provided. She saved your life and then gave you a future worth living." Emily's response demonstrated the wisdom and emotional intelligence that had developed through her work with the foundation and her understanding of complex family dynamics. Rather than expressing anger or demanding explanations for abandonment, she chose forgiveness as the path that would honor both Caleb's memory and my example of choosing mercy over revenge. "Holding hatred would dishonor cousin Caleb's memory and everything Mama Viv taught me about protecting people," Emily said quietly, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had thought deeply about forgiveness and justice. "I forgive you for the choices you made, but I want you to know that Vivian is my real mother now." The emotional complexity of Emily's forgiveness was remarkable in its maturity and grace. She offered comfort to her dying biological mother while maintaining absolute loyalty to me as the person who had raised, protected, and loved her. Her ability to separate forgiveness from forgetting mercy from naivety demonstrated that she had internalized the lessons about justice and compassion that our work together had taught. Selena's death came peacefully 3 days later, with Emily holding her hand while I stood nearby providing support for both of them. In her final moments, Selena had found some measure of redemption through her daughter's forgiveness, dying with the knowledge that Emily had grown into someone remarkable despite the trauma and abandonment she had experienced. The funeral was small and private, attended only by Emily, myself, and the hospice chaplain who had provided spiritual support during Selena's final days. Emily chose to speak briefly about forgiveness and second chances, her words reflecting the maturity that had developed through surviving family betrayal and learning to help other children facing similar circumstances. Driving home from Minneapolis, I experienced a profound sense of completion that was different from the cold satisfaction revenge had provided years earlier. Selena's death had closed the final chapter of my family's destruction, while demonstrating that Emily had developed into someone capable of extraordinary grace and wisdom. "I think we should visit Cousin Caleb's grave and tell him what happened," Emily suggested as we crossed the Iowa state line. "He should know that his death saved not just me, but all the children we've helped through the foundation." Our visit to Maplewood Cemetery that evening felt like a sacred ritual, an opportunity to share with Caleb's spirit the news that his suffering had ultimately created something beautiful and life-saving. Emily placed fresh flowers on his grave, while I arranged the foundation's annual report, showing the 43 children we had protected from family financial abuse. "Your cousin's death taught us how to recognize danger and prevent tragedies," Emily said, kneeling beside the headstone where Caleb's name was etched in granite. "Because of what happened to you, dozens of other children are alive and safe today." Standing in the Iowa twilight beside my son's grave with the child I had chosen to save and love, I felt the weight of years of planning revenge and ultimately healing settling into something like peace. The journey from devastated mother to systematic destroyer to protective advocate had been longer and more complex than I could have imagined, but it had led to this moment of understanding and closure. The protection charm Caleb had made for me still hung around my neck, its frayed rope and wooden beads worn smooth by years of handling during difficult moments. As Emily finished her conversation with her cousin's memory, I touched the necklace and whispered words that felt like a final benediction on everything we had built together. "Your protection charm worked after all, baby boy," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the cemetery toward whatever realm holds the spirits of innocent children. "Through me, you're still saving children every day." 5 years later, I stood in the conference room of our Chicago headquarters, watching Emily address the Foundation's annual gala with the poise and passion of someone who had found her life's calling. At 19, she served as Caleb's Shield Foundation's youngest board member, while preparing to start her freshman year at Northwestern University's pre-law program, determined to become the child advocacy lawyer our movement needed. One mother's love for her lost son created an army of protection for children everywhere. Emily told the audience of donors, legislators, and child protection professionals who had gathered to celebrate our 5th anniversary. Caleb Chen's death taught us to recognize danger before it becomes tragedy. And today we operate in 12 states with over 200 children alive, because someone finally learned how to listen. The statistics she presented documented our transformation from a personal mission of healing into a national network of protection. Our early warning systems had prevented 17 planned murders of children by family members seeking insurance payouts. Our legal advocacy had resulted in the prosecution of 43 adults for financial crimes targeting minors. Our emergency housing network had provided safe placement for children fleeing families that viewed them as financial assets rather than human beings. Watching Emily command that room with confidence and wisdom reminded me that some good things could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. She had evolved from the dying child I had saved through bone marrow donation into a young woman whose survival story inspired legislation funding and systematic change that protected vulnerable children across the country. The anniversary of Caleb's death had become my annual pilgrimage to Maplewood Cemetery, a private ritual where I could reflect on how far we had traveled from that terrible night 15 years earlier. This year, I carried the Foundation's complete case files, wanting to share with my son's spirit the names of every child whose life had been saved because his death had taught us what to look for. Timothy Hansen, Marcus Williams, Sarah Chen, David Rodriguez. I read aloud the list, continuing for several minutes as I detailed each child who was alive, because Caleb's innocent observations had revealed the patterns of family financial predation. 207 children, baby boy. 207 futures that exist because your death meant something. The protection charm he had made for me 15 years earlier was showing its age, the colorful rope frayed and several wooden beads chipped from years of handling during difficult moments. I placed it gently on his headstone, where it would remain as a permanent reminder of his loving spirit and the protection that had grown from his sacrifice. "Your death meant something, baby," I whispered to the granite that bore his name. "You're still protecting children through every life we save." As I walked away from the cemetery toward my car, I noticed a young mother approaching Caleb's grave with a small boy who looked to be about 7 years old. She carried fresh flowers and moved with the reverent care of someone who understood the significance of the place she was visiting. I paused at my car door, watching as she knelt beside the headstone and whispered words I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. The boy placed a small toy truck beside the flowers, his gesture carrying the innocent generosity that reminded me why protecting children mattered more than anything else in this world. As they walked away hand in hand, the mothers whispered, "Thank you," carried across the cemetery. Evening air confirmation that Caleb's story had become legend among families who understood that love could transcend death and that one child's sacrifice could create protection for countless others.